All right. And Bennett says that we are live. So welcome back here to On the Line. I'm sitting here with Dr. Joel Biermann and with Pastor David Ramirez. So today we are launching a new series that we'll be doing throughout the year here on the Line. And that is we're doing a debate series. So all of the topics that we'll be covering in the 6-part debate series will be things that are related to the Lutheran Church and Lutheran theology. They'll fall into 2 categories. One will be debates that are kind of inter-Lutheran, so think conversations that are taking place here in the Lutheran Church. Some will also be interdenominational down the road. So we'll announce what those topics are as those debates get scheduled, but we're very excited for our first one here. And before we start, I do want to say a couple words about our sponsor and then also kind of the framework of how this is going to work. So this whole series is being sponsored by Luther Classical College. We've had many of their professors on before, a lot of the guys that have been working to kick off, and we're very excited to say that as of now, they are having their first class. So they've got 30-some students there. They're launching. They've done a lot of good work. You've heard us talk about this a lot with some of the individuals that are there, but they are a distinctly classical college, the first one in the Lutheran Church, and they're distinctly Lutheran. And if you go to their website, you can find out much more as far as like the impressive tuition that they're able to offer to students and some of the things going on in their chapel life and such. And I think it's just kind of a good showcase of what Luther Classical College is about. They really like rhetoric, kind of the discussion around really important ideas and tackling important subjects. And that's why they wanted to do this series so that we can do just that and bring these topics to light in the Lutheran Church. So today we're going to be doing our first topic, and that's going to be a discussion on Christian nationalism. If you don't know what that is, that's okay. We're going to introduce that in just a minute. So I want to give a couple intros and then kind of the layout of how today's going to go. So to my left, we have Dr. Joel Biermann, who he has been a professor at Concordia St. Louis in the systematics department for over 20 years. You've written, is it 5 books?
I guess
4 or 5
coming out.
5th book is coming out.
Yeah.
You've also produced a course for the Lutheran Institute of Theology, which was just great. And he's also been a guest on the Line. And he will be taking the stance kind of against Christian nationalism. And of course, he'll explain that. To my right is Pastor David Ramirez, who is the founder of the Bugenhagen Conference. You're a parish pastor. You also did your STM, if I remember, on Martin Luther on religious liberty. Yes. So this is a subject that you've been engaged in over the years. You, of course, also have been on the Line. So we've got 2 great guests, and the discussion is going to be very lively, and we're very much looking forward to it. So the way that this is going to work is it's going to be kind of a hybrid between a formal debate and a discussion. So we're going to start off with about 5 minutes of opening statements where you can hear each of their theses on where they're coming from. And then really we're going to just kind of move into more of a discussion where they can go back and forth rather than a hyper-structured debate ongoing. We do have 5 categories that we've kind of agreed upon, so we kind of know the scope of where we're going to go. But that's, I think, about it. One last comment. This is being released live, so that means that you can put your comments in the comment board. Both of these individuals will be there to engage in your questions, so feel free to post questions. They'll be able to answer, and we will be watching just to kind of hear your thoughts as this debate continues. So that is all for our intro, which means we are ready to jump in. So, David, if you want to start off, and you can kind of give your theses, and built into that, you can kind of explain what Christian nationalism is.
Sure. Sounds good. I've got 4 just basic points. And the first point is that every Christian, regardless of what community they're in, should want a Christian community, whether that be a Christian town or a Christian county or a Christian state, and I mean United States state, or a Christian nation. And what I mean by that, I'll get back to. My second point is that this is a necessary risk. I'm fully aware that there's a lot of temptations and pitfalls that could be inherent in this, but I think it's a necessary risk for Christians to not only want, but to work towards as well. My third point is that this is grounded on our vocations as Christians, what we are called to do. And then the fourth point is that I'm really glad that this conversation is going. So to go back around to point number 1, Christians should want a Christian community. If you want to call that Christian nationalism, that's fine. In talking to Professor Biermann, I'm not wedded to the term itself, but rather the concept. So if Christian nationalism, if I got to define it, or wanting a Christian nation, it would be that a Christian wants his community to be Christian, whereas I would say that means that the Word of God predominates, not just in terms of belief of individual people or the church as one of the kingdoms or realms, however you want to use that language, but also not just in thought or word, but also in deed. So that would be my definition of also the term Christendom, is where God's word predominates in society, culture, legal system, anything like that. It predominates. Now, obviously, different places with different confessing Christians, that's going to look different. And it's going to look different because of historical circumstances and also what is possible in that time and place. But I think that's the best definition I can give, where the Word of God predominates, not just in the church as church, but in the community as also a political entity. And I think very briefly of why we should want this. I'm not going to go through 15 proof texts, but why we should want this is for the same reason that any Christian, whether it be a father or a mother or even a child, should want a Christian family. Yes, there's an inherent risk to this, as I know Professor Biermann's going to bring up, and I'm going to acknowledge that there are some temptations and pitfalls with this undertaking. But I would point out that anything can become an idol. As our Lord says, he who does not hate father and mother is not worthy of me, So even something that's commanded by the fourth commandment to love, honor, obey, and respect our parents, and no one would debate that parents are a good gift of God. Yet at the same time, even parents can become an idol. Even a spouse could become an idol. So it's not just money or power or things like that can become idols. Any good gift, as we see all through the scriptures, anything can become an idol. So that's why what I mean about there is a necessary risk. Just like we don't say, let's not get married or let's not respect our parents because our parents or our spouse or our marriage could either fall apart or not work out well or become an idol. I think in the same sense that because all peoples and all people individually are called to what? Believe in God and to live that out in their vocations. I think that's true of nations, communities. As Luther says, all communities are God's communities, and they should serve, love, honor, and obey him in all facets of life. So not just the Christian as Christian or the father in the domestic estate as father or mother or child or sibling, but also rulers and also citizens. Now that's going to work out in different ways in different circumstances and situations, but I think this is part of our calling or vocation as people in political communities. One other note to go back to the third point, so I think I've covered what I believe a desire for Christian nation is, or Christian nationalism, if you want to use that term, and also that it's a necessary risk. The third thing, in terms of grounding on vocation, I think that, and this may get a little bit more particular, that yes, there's a particular danger of people getting too wrapped up in political power, too wrapped up in politics in general. It can become an idol. And yet at the same time, I would assert that in this day and age where you have a huge danger of people becoming worldly, falling away from the faith, at least in my experience, and I would assert this is a pretty general experience, that I'm not worried, to put some flesh and bones on it, I'm not worried about my confirmation kids growing up and getting obsessed with Christian nationalism or making America a Christian country near as much. I'm not saying it isn't a danger, but I'm not worried about that near as much as them going off to college and forsaking the faith for worldly reasons. Now, you might classify that as a worldly reason, but I mean the typical worldly reasons. They want to live and let live. They don't want to be called a judgmental Christian. They want to sleep with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and so they give up the faith and conveniently believe in evolution, and we're just animals that need to do things. That's my much greater worry. Furthermore, in terms of vocation, I'm also, again, in my experience, the people who are interested in Christian nationalism, whether it's expressed through those terms as such or not, but a Christian nation, they tend, in my experience, to be the ones who are also most devoted to being a good father, mother, son, daughter. They're very active in their church, and they're active in their home. So I don't see this as an either or thing, but them wanting to live out being a good citizen or a ruler or magistrate in whatever capacity they may have. So I think that, yes, there's always dangers with any undertaking, but in my experience, this actually coheres with their broader calling to be a Christian and in their domestic life. Last but not least, I think that not only is it a necessary risk to want for and work toward a Christian community on whatever level you're talking about, but also that this conversation is huge, as I think anybody with ears to hear can tell in the broader culture. And I'm very, very excited. So this isn't exactly part of my thesis. I think we'd all agree on this, but I'm really, really happy that this conversation is happening, because for far too long, we've had American Lutherans conflating the distinction between the two kingdoms, or as Professor Biermann likes to say, the two realms, with the separation of church and state. And I'm very excited that we're getting back to our forefathers, where they had a much more integrative understanding of this. They did not want confusion between the realms or the kingdoms, but they wanted cooperation. So I think it's wonderful that the debate about Christian nationalism has moved us to the point where we can say, well, let's stop arguing between cooperation and total separation. Let's talk about how we cooperate, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate. And this Christian nationalist debate is forcing us to talk about that, to think about it. And the other voices in America that are talking about Christian nationalism, frankly, I know this is a slam dunk. Again, it's not very controversial, are voices that are not Lutheran. And if we don't speak to this, then the Christian nationalisms that are out there growing are not going to give as good of a confession as we would as Lutherans, who do have a robust and a correct view of church and state. So not only is there a necessary risk in undertaking wanting your community to be Christian, as I would assert, but also this conversation's happening. And if we don't speak, our clarity that we've been given from the Word of God and from our forefathers is just going to be lost, or at least not spoken and thought about. So that's where I would start, and those would be the 4 points that I would lay out.
All right, Pastor Ramirez, thank you. And Dr. Joel Biermann.
All right, good. Thanks for the introduction, laying some things out. That's really helpful. My first thought, I just wrote this down, in fact, is I think a lot of people are going to be really disappointed that nobody's taking up the cause of democratic freedom as being the ideal. And neither one of us are on board with that.
No.
And so if somebody is looking for that debate, that's not going to happen today, because we've got two people who have both written that off. And we'll clarify that more as we go along. But just to ground some things here a little bit, and just maybe this helps to reinforce maybe I think where we're both coming from on a lot of this, is I would start by making really clear that government is a good gift from God. It's not a bad thing. It's not inherently evil. And there are parts of Christendom that don't even accept that. Government is somehow inherently evil because it uses violence, and violence is always wrong. The classic Anabaptist. No, we don't accept that. Scripture's clear. Government is a good gift from God. I'm of the opinion even that government would exist in God's creation even if it hadn't fallen, because I think there needs to be an ordering to our life together, and even a life that's living the way it's supposed to, there's still structure and still guidance. And so I don't think government is somehow a stopgap because of the evil in the world. And I hear that a lot from people in my circles even, that, yeah, government's necessary evil, sin has come, but I don't think so. Government is God's way of just organizing our life together. And so it's not a bad thing. It's not inherently wrong. However, post-fall, government is inherently imperfect. And it's frequently inadequate and problematic, and sometimes it's downright evil. But so are the other two estates. And so family, as you pointed out, can also become problematic as an idol. And you also have broken people filling those, because all the estates, the government, the family, and the church are all inhabited and run by fallen people. And that's why the church has problems. The government has problems. Families have problems. None of us are perfect. And so that creates an inherent tension. This good gift that's messed up, we've lived in that all the time. This is the reality of living in a broken world. So third point I want to kind of make, just kind of grounding this stuff, is that Christians then are people who have been redeemed by God into the fullness of God's forgiveness and grace. The gospel's there, Christ's grace awesome, makes us what we should be before God, but it also restores us to God's plan in his creation. And so Christians are people who kind of know the score. They know God's plan. They're kind of in on stuff. They kind of get it. We understand how the world is supposed to work. We understand how the estates work together. And so we should live accordingly in whatever place God places us, in whatever vocations we have. You brought up vocation. That's going to be, I think, a really key part of what we talk about here. I think it's really important. And that means we work for God's plan so that God's plan will be at work in all three estates, so that families and governments and churches are working the way God would have them work. We all are striving for this. Problems come, though, in how these fit together. So my kind of bottom line concerns about Christian nationalism, and this is probably even greater concerns by defining Christian nationalism a little differently, which I tend to. I usually put a stronger emphasis on Christian nationalism seeking to impose Christian reality on their wider world. And that's where I think problems come in, at that kind of idea of what do you mean by imposition? Not necessarily even force, but just kind of like, we're going to make you do this. And that creates all kinds of interesting issues around politics and government about how much can you make people do things, which you can. And then the question is, should we? So I would contend that Christian nationalism is almost always rightly motivated and sincerely undertaken. I have no question about that. I don't want to disparage the motivations or why people are doing things, even though you might wonder sometimes of some people who are advocating things like, where are you coming from, dude? What's your real goal here? But I think it's rightly motivated and it's sincerely undertaken. But I would contend that it's problematic for three big things: in its assumptions about the estates and their interrelationships and how those things actually fit together. That's a big part of this. You know, how do the three estates work? The family, the church, and the government. And it's also, I would say, Christian nationalism is somewhat naive about the extent of the fallenness of the world, and maybe a little bit. My thought, even when you're talking to David, is just a little bit naive. Are we going first names here?
That's good. Yes.
Good. Let's keep it simple. Let's do that. That's how I'd like to do it. So I think when you mentioned, David, about the creating a Christian kind of world, and I'm thinking, wow, this is the Western Enlightenment world we're living in. Let's come to terms with that reality. And so we don't want to be naive about the fallenness of the world or the extent of that fall. And then I would also say that Christian nationalism is often misguided in its goals and what it's actually trying to accomplish. So that's where my concerns come in with it. This is going to play out, as I'll flesh this out more, a lot with what does it mean for us to be God's church in this world? What is our task? And my driving contention is our task is to witness the reality of God's truth, God's grace, God's plan for the world to the rest of the world. And I believe the best way we witness that is by the way that we live it out, not by trying to assert it and making other people who aren't quite on board with it yet do it anyway. And so I think we actually end up, especially in a Western Enlightenment post-Christendom world in which we live, I think we end up hurting and being quite detrimental to our witness by trying to insist on making those things happen. And so I think it becomes counterproductive. It's kind of a key part of where I'm coming from. So that's my basic thoughts starting out.
All right. Thank you, Joel. Now I'll kind of open it up to you guys to kind of push into things that the other person said or ask questions. I've got maybe about a question for each of you, but I'll let you guys start.
No.
Sure. I've got a couple questions on those 3 points. I want to hear at some point more about your assumptions about the inner workings or the misunderstanding about how the three estates function. Mm-hmm. But I assume you'll get to that. The naivety of the extent of the fallenness of the world, I would push back on that being something that Christian nationalists have, that naivete, or at least I would say, which Christian nationalists are you talking about?
Okay.
Because I can speak for myself. I certainly look at the scriptures and I see a great sensitivity to the particular situations and circumstances on how that gets played out in political jurisdictions. Yeah. Like, it's very obvious that God wants, kiss the son lest he be angry and ye perish in the way. I mean, all kings, all rulers, all nations are to worship God. And yet at the same time, you see a vast difference between how the Israelite kings deal with this versus Nebuchadnezzar or the Assyrians and things like that. So I agree with you, but I would push back that at least myself is naive about that. I think that where you are at has to be taken into account. You have to be prudent. Yeah. You have to be realistic about not just the fallenness of the world, but that particular place and those circumstances. Similar, I'd like to hear more about their misguided goals, but my overarching question to you right off the bat would be like, who do you see as Christian nationalists in your description doing what you are guilty of doing what you have asserted?
You want name? I'm not going to name names. I'm probably capable of even doing that, saying, well, this person. My concern is the part of this is problematic. And we should just address this also. Part of this becomes problematic because we have the media, which most of us in the church are suspicious of, the Western media as a whole, who like to pillory the church whenever they can and try to badmouth the church. And so to bring up Christian nationalism, it creates this huge boogeyman that people are terrified of. Oh, look, these Christian nationalists. Yeah. But unfortunately, there are people from the evangelical world who jump right into that and kind of own that. And you start seeing the conflation of Christian witness and American patriotism. So I'm a good Christian. That makes me a good American. And the American flag is wrapped around the cross. And that's the kind of stuff that sort of drives me nuts. It's the 4th of July stuff when people start doing we're going to have our patriotic service this weekend. And so you see the Christian flags coming out everywhere in the church. And then you'll see Grandma Schmidt who comes to church, but she's got her Christian t-shirt on, and he's kind of Grandma Schmidt's I know anyway. And it'll be a cross emblazoned with the American flag right across the cross, this kind of thing. That's the kind of stuff that I think is really misguided, because I think people start to conflate church and their nation. That plays into this. And then you have people who start thinking that if we could just get this person elected, if we could just get this law passed, that's going to fix things. No, it's not. And that becomes part of this kind of the agenda. If we could just do this. And the concern I have is people start to focus more on those things instead of what I contend to be the things they should be focusing on, which provides a better witness to the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I have some very, very similar concerns about all the same things. Yeah. I don't think we're in disagreement about that kind of confusion or improper mingling between cross and country. Yet at the same time, I guess a follow-up question would be, is there not, though, also a good inherent desire for people to want to have their social, political community to be united in not just common civic life, but also common faith? And that's a natural, good desire.
Yes.
And so I guess I would make a distinction between kind of folk Christian nationalism and a lot of what you're talking about versus the conversation going on in the last, 3 to 4 years about Christian nationalism that doesn't just include kind of the heirs of Jerry Falwell or the 700 Club or whatever. Yeah. I think we'd be agreed on our evaluation of those folks. But that's why I want to probe a little bit more deeply, because you already said what I was going to say. A lot of this reaction against Christian nationalism is the boogeyman of, NPR or whatever. Yep. You know what I mean?
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. And they're not fair.
No.
At all.
No. But they can find people who do what they're accusing them of. There are people who do this, out there in the wider world.
I agree.
Evangelicalism. Yeah.
Sure.
So they exist.
But they do exist. Mm-hmm. And that's been a problem for decades. It's nothing new.
Correct.
But I'm talking more about like what, and I know you said, well, I'm not going to name names, but I really think that like Christian nationalism now in the last 4 or 5 years, there's a real variety of Christian nationalisms.
I agree with that.
There was a great paper put out by Cambridge University do you know their publication, Politics and Religion?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it came out just this summer or late spring, and it was called The Varieties of Christian Nationalisms.
Okay.
And they had a very good diagnostic tool
okay.
Yeah, and it was a threefold distinction. It was kind of what we're talking about. They called it charismatic Christian nationalism because a lot of the folks are heirs of Jerry Falwell, and it's kind of this cross and country thing in kind of a folk way that is very problematic. But then they also pointed to like Catholic integralists, which that's its own sideshow, so to speak.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's not irrelevant.
No, it's not irrelevant, not at all. But then they also pointed to magisterial Reformed Christian nationalism, or they called Calvinist Christian nationalism. Yeah. And that's really burst on the scene. And so, I mean, I think we got to be careful about like, who are we talking about?
That's fair.
So who are you talking about?
I'm concerned about the kind of Roman Catholic integralism, which to be clear is this idea that God has ultimately controlled everything. And so the world works best when the church is running everything. That's kind of bottom line, boiling it all down.
Yeah.
And it's what we saw in the Catholic Middle Ages. They haven't given it up. It's still there.
Of course not.
And so there are people who are trying to reassert this. You get the Patrick Deneen's who are huge fans, and it's got legs into some of our leaders in Congress right now, and some of our political leaders who are very sympathetic to this. And that's kind of crazy. Yeah. But what's even crazier is when you have evangelicals who are getting on board with it because we're going to make a Christian America. That is a concern, and I'm hearing you say you're not crazy about that either.
Yeah, and I guess I would push back against. Well, let me just ask a diagnostic question. When you say evangelicals getting into the Catholic integralism, I'm sure they're out there.
Yeah,
but that is not the main trend. The most prominent, if you want to say Reformed, magisterial Reformed, or Calvinist Christian nationalists have explicitly rejected Catholic integralism as a idea that, I mean, everyone's going to agree that God is in control over everything and is Lord over everything, but they would explicitly and have explicitly in their books rejected that the church is over the state.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the two most prominent Christian nationalist books, because the folk Christian nationalism is more of a cultural thing, and there's not a lot of books written. It's much more
grassroots. Just
grassroots. Yeah. I mean, there's a few books like that Seven Mountain stuff. That's all wrapped up with charismatic stuff, like Paula White, Trump's advisor, spiritual advisor, right. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the Calvinist Christian nationalists explicitly reject that and the Catholic integralism, and they really focus in on not something that we would 100% agree with, but as magisterial Lutherans, at least in terms of history, in terms of understanding it, it's much, much closer to us. And the two most significant books are definitely Andrew Torba and Andrew Isker's book. That's just called Christian Nationalism. It's super popular. And it ranked number 12 on the Amazon nonfiction books the week after it was released.
Okay.
I mean, that's all nonfiction books.
Yeah, right.
Number 12. So I think that in terms of fair representation of what the Christian nationalists who are driving the discussion are saying, there's not only different ones, but that one. And then the other one that is very dense and very theological and trying to do a reformed, specifically Anglo-American reformed presentation is Stephen Wolfe's book, which is The Case for Christian Nationalism. And I don't think that without having those books central to at least reformed Calvinist Christian nationalism, we without identifying these different varieties, because that's what's driving the conversation. I mean, book sales, reviews, and all the discussions on podcasts and things like that, it's being driven far more by that, which NPR and the quote unquote, leftist media is only focused on the charismatic one. And that's what's actually driving the debate.
But that might be driving the debate on an academic level or in those
or even
circles.
Popular level.
But I'm not so sure about that. The popular level I encounter, I don't see many people aware of that. They're more kind of like I was saying, the kind of classic 4th of July sort of, just me and my American faith, and and I think the folk popular level is still really quite dominant.
I agree, and that's how it works off. It works out on a parish level.
That's where I'm coming in. Yeah, but you know about that.
I totally agree. Yeah, but I think that there's also a generational divide because on the parish level, those books are being read.
Okay,
even if they're not being read, the podcasts and the blogging and all of that kind of stuff is paying attention. Right. And I think those two texts, I don't agree with all of it.
Yeah,
I mean, the Torba Isker book puts out a very mild form of Christian nationalism, far more mild than anything in Lutheran Saxony. And the Wolfe book is very rooted in the Anglo-American experience. And again, it's not Catholic integralist, and it's not just kind of, God and country folk Christian nationalism. And so, I mean, I think we got to be aware that that's where most of the discussion is being driven among younger, engaged Christians.
Yeah, okay, and that's fair. Go Go ahead.
If you had a final thought,
that's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I've got a question for each of you, and this will move us into the first of the five. So this has been good introductory. I think we've even kind of started to straddle a little bit with the first. So we'll kind of, move into that formally, and then we can move out when that's fitting. So I'll start with first question for you, Joel, and if you can, perfect, move your mic up a little bit. So one thing, kind of like what's a popular movement where this seems to be taking place, and I think a good concrete example, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on something like this. So the rad trad, it's kind of like the trad Catholic movement, which has gained a lot of publicity. I'm not really on social media, but you can. Even with just like glances, you can see these things are pretty quite prominent. And it would be things like, pushing, young people pushing for this, and a lot of churches and areas doing this where it's like, okay, we're going to get back to having Eucharist processions, right? Where they'll come and they'll be, fully garbed, and they're going to go out into the streets and they're going to march around and whatnot. And part of the mantra there is we're going to be asserting kind of this. So it's less bringing the church the state into the church, and it's more kind of boldly and unapologetically pushing the church out into the state, into that public sphere. So I'm just interested, something like that. What's your reaction to something like that?
This kind of gets to the core of so much of what I'm trying to get at here is, and I'll kind of pick up on a couple of things just from before. Should Christians be working for a community around them that is Christian? Yeah. I mean, yeah. And what does it mean? What do we mean by Christian here, though? Because see, do I want my neighbors to know that Jesus Christ died and rose for them and confess him as their Lord and Savior? Yeah, I want that for them. So that's the fundamental evangelistic move. And if I'm trying to make a Christian America, I want every American to be a Christian. I want that. And if they're Christians, then they're going to be living like Christians. That'd be awesome. Of course I want that. Of course I'm striving for that. Of course I'm working for that. That is absolutely the goal. And so that means that should we be doing what we can to make that witness compelling and winsome and engaging? Yes. And so then the question is, how best do we do that? And that's what we're not going to all agree on. So we do a Corpus Christi processional around the neighborhood. Now they know we're really Christian. Yeah, they do. Is this a positive thing or a negative thing? I'm not so sure. And I'm not sure it's going to come across with the, wow, that's awesome. And it might for some. Others might be like, who do these people think they are? What's going on? And so I'm not saying that we should avoid being weird. We have to be careful not to offend people. The gospel offends. It's just the way it is. And if we're going to live a Christian life, it's going to be a problem to people. It's going to be perplexing to people. It's going to turn some people off. I get that. But we also, I think, need to be clear on what it is we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to go about it. And I want to make sure that the witness that I'm giving in my life and in my family's life and in my congregation's life is Jesus Christ is Lord of all. He died for you, and he wants you to know his reality. And we want you to be part of this. And so I think the most compelling witness we give is not the Corpus Christi procession around the neighborhood or going out and, making protests or even trying to fight for legislation and being really aggressive about it with petition drives and stuff. I think that becomes counterproductive in actually witnessing the reality of Christ to my neighbors. That's where I'm coming from.
Okay.
And so the goal, I want everybody Christian. Do I want to live in a Christian nation? That'd be awesome. I'm not complaining about that. I'm not a fan of pluralism inherently, except for the fact that God has created a whole bunch of races and a whole bunch of cultures, and there's nothing inherently wrong about that kind of variety. Because, of course, at the eschaton, every race, tribe, and nation will be there, and that means we're still the uniqueness of what we are. But there's nothing sacred about, protecting everybody's individual freedom. I'm not a fan of that. Maybe we'll get into that eventually because we'll be seeing eye to eye on that one. But my concern is the witness that we give and the zeal for trying to achieve some of these goals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And for clarification, no one here is advocating for Eucharistic processions in the streets. No, right? But that's just as an example of something that
can I just follow up with a clarifying question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick. So obviously I don't like Corpus Christi processions.
Okay.
But and then the other thing you mentioned was protesting, and I'm not a huge fan of protesting either, actually. But the third thing you mentioned was pushing legislation. Now, obviously, it would need to be done in the right way.
That's key.
But I think, and we can get closer into it if Stecker wants to do that later. But I don't see it as opposed I guess I should say I don't see it as an either or thing. Like witnessing personally or corporately as the church to your neighbor about our truth, the truth, is obviously paramount. And yet I don't see that as an either or that we have to choose. Now, in certain circumstances, maybe you got to put first things first, but I see it as part of the same package. It's not either or, it's both.
And it often is the same package, because if I'm just living my Christian life, I'm going to be making an impact, and I'm going to be voting a certain way, always. And might I be motivated to say, I'm going to contact my legislator about this, or I'm going to go to the school board meeting because I'm really concerned about this? Absolutely. This is good. But see, then when you're there, you have to be careful about how am I portraying myself? I am Christ's representative here. How am I going about this? And that's key.
And that's where prudence comes in, and that's where circumstances.
That's right. And humility, huge dose of humility.
But I guess I really think that part of our vocation as Christians is to do both.
Agreed.
Okay.
Agreed. Because God gives us vocations in all three estates.
Exactly.
Different ones, different degrees of them. But I'm not immune to any of them. I can't say, well, I'm just a family guy.
Yeah.
No, you are living in this world so that you are concerned about all three estates. Yeah. Bonhoeffer's clear about, he talks about the 4 mandates, splitting out work from home. But he's clear, all 4 mandates are all of us all the time. We live in all of them. And it's the same thing with Luther. All 3 estates make responsibilities for all of us. And this is where Bonhoeffer is really leaning into the whole idea of the mandates, is these vocational tasks are responsibilities. And we all have responsibilities in all these areas. So do I have a responsibility for the government? Yes. And living in an American context, a democratic republic, I've got an even greater responsibility, because in a sense, I'm part of the government. So I can't just bury my head and not do anything, which is why I've gone on record saying I think it's wrong for Christians not to vote. Because they have a responsibility to do that. They can't just say, I'm not going to do that. It's not my thing. No, you have to get engaged. Mm-hmm. And so then how much, in what way, depends on your vocation, your skills, your abilities, but always with that humility. And I guess what I see lacking too often in some of the Christian nationalists I've heard from is that sense of humility and that sense of being willing to be patient. And it's more the assertiveness that I think I can get concerned about.
And when you say the Christian nationalists you've heard from, are you talking about specific figures or?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about my encounters with people in the parish who are saying this world's just going down the tubes. We got to fix it. We need to get this guy elected. We need to fight for this. We need to do whatever kinds of things. That's where I'm talking about, more of the kind of concrete experiences I've had.
Okay.
Let me move. So we've moved through a lot of the first one. So, for those listening, the first one was the task of the church and the state, which we've been that's more of an overview. We've been doing that. I do want to ask one more clarifying on each side, and we can keep this relatively brief. What I want to know is kind of where the line is. And so from your standpoint, Ramirez, earlier on you talked about, hey, in these different, in different churches and different denominations, these things might manifest differently or different times and contexts, right? Mm-hmm. But what I want to know from you is, what are the necessities? So in other words, if we go below this line, if we as the church or we as Christians are not doing X, Y, and Z, no matter what context it is, then we are failing at our vocation as, if you want to go with as citizens, for instance, right? So where's the line where we don't go below? And then obviously your question, Joel, is going to be on the opposite end. What kind of things do we do that are pushing us where we're crossing the line on the other end? So.
Well, I mean, if you want to know where the line is, I mean, we're on the line actually, but that was cheap. I know.
Well played.
Yeah,
Bennett loves it.
It was cheap. Yeah. But honestly, I mean, I can't answer that satisfactorily because the context is going to matter so much.
Yeah.
I mean,
what about abortion? If we would that be like a concrete line to where, once again, you're not going to go as far as saying, okay, you have to be picketing or something like that. But that there has to be some kind of steadfast pushback against a moral law that's in place that is detrimentally harmful.
Well, you've already said it. There's going to have to be steadfast pushback against anti-Christian things, regardless of the context. But the context is going to determine how much you can do, how far you should go. I mean, again, Nebuchadnezzar, when he finally is humbled by God, he says you can't blaspheme the true Lord of heavens, or however he phrases it. I mean, that's a blasphemy law. It really is. Now, he doesn't get rid of all the pagan worship in his empire, but he starts where he can start, Now, in Israel, especially in the good days, lots of stuff gets taken out, but you have that refrain all through Kings and Chronicles, so-and-so tore down the pagan altars, but he left the high places up. He could only do so much. So, I mean, I know I'm kind of kicking the can down the road and seemingly dodging the question, but I'm not. You answered it already. There has to be steadfast resistance against unchristian things, but where you are pushing back and what means you have at your disposal are going to be different in any context. My whole point is, and I do think Biermann's agreeing with me here, is that we need to have the ideal set. We want a Christian community, regardless if it's a town, a country, a nation, any community, to ultimately be working towards.
So it's an orientation. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, an orientation, and there is an ideal goal. It's kind of like if you are a young pastor or a new pastor in a new call, and you say, you know what, there are some things that I think could be better at this parish. You're going to walk in with an ideal in mind, but that's also going to be shaped by the congregation's history, the circumstances. If you change things, how much disturbance is going to result. And so, but you can't even approach those problems unless you have an ideal in mind.
Okay.
And maybe that ideal actually is shaped by that particular community. And if it's not, you're a fool. And yet at the same time, like that's why you have to have, is it ideal to have Christendom, to have a Christian nation or a Christian community where the word of God predominates in all these facets according to all three estates? If we can say yes, then we can get down to the real discussion of how far, by what means, and all that kind of stuff.
Okay. So that should always be a stated goal, how to get there. That's always
I think the scriptures are absolutely clear about this. I think our forefathers are absolutely clear about this. The nitty-gritty is how do you do it? How do you avoid pitfalls? How far do you go? What means do you use? All those sorts of things. But if you have the goal, then you can actually have the discussion.
Okay.
Yeah. No, the goal is the restoration. Now, when is that going to happen? When Christ returns.
not fully, of course.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
But the goal, and that we can't, and it's cheap to say, wow, that goal is impossible, so forget it.
Right.
No, we can't forget it. So I'm agreeing with you. We need to stay engaged. We need to keep working. We can't ever just wash our hands and say, oh, time to go off and join the commune. We're going to check out. I'm off the grid. No, Christians can't do this. And anytime Christians are tempted to go off the grid and, circle the wagons, that's just dead wrong. And that whole circle the wagons mentality is way too prevalent in our own church body, from my opinion. It's kind of like, we'll take our ball and go home. We don't need to worry about anybody else. No, we need to keep engaging that world, but we need to be engaging it. And you're exactly right. How are we engaging? What do you mean by that engagement? What's that look like? But you wanted me to talk about.
Yeah. Would there be any specifics that you could name where like this is going too far?
Too far in overreaching, you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I'd probably say that for the church to be coming out advocating for, we're going to pass an anti-blasphemy law. We're going to pass a law that everybody must be in church every Sunday. We're going to pass a law. Would that be good for you to be in church? Yeah. Do I want everybody in church? Yeah. We're going to pass a law. And well, what do you mean? Who's going to pass it? And so should the church be advocating for that? Probably not. That's not a smart thing right now. Yeah, probably you'd agree with that too. That's like overreaching.
Let me have some fun and push back.
Yeah. Well, okay, go ahead. Perfect. This will bring it. So this is our second category.
Yeah.
So I'll just introduce that and then
sure.
Go right
absolutely.
And the second one is basically looking at the first and the second table.
Yeah.
As far as the commandments are concerned. So second table is dealing with, you and your neighbor, and the first one is dealing primarily with you and God, right? With the first three commandments, with the fourth kind of a bridge between the two.
Sure.
So the question kind of in the second one is, okay, there's one, it's much easier for us to say, yes, the government should enforce the second table of the law. And then the question is, should the government also enforce the first table of the law, which is exactly what you were talking about with blasphemy law. So go ahead, David, you had some thoughts. So
yeah, sure. First of all, I think that Professor Biermann and I would, or Joel, sorry. I think that we would agree that under certain circumstances, it would be good for the government to have the outward maintenance of both tables of the law.
No problem.
Yeah. And even some things that would be classified under blasphemy laws.
Correct. Luther advocated for it. I know that. I get it.
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
a time for that.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, there's a time and a place for that.
Can you explain that? Like, what did that look like? Because I think that is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, Luther, there's a big debate over his development of his thought about this, but suffice it to say, where he ends up is less of an emphasis between the two tables and more of an emphasis between the inward keeping of the two tables, the entire Ten Commandments, and the outward. And that is what we should remember that Luther was fine with blasphemy laws. He was totally opposed to false public preaching. He was not stupid. He obviously steadfastly always said, you cannot coerce faith.
Right.
You can't force belief. But that doesn't mean that you can't say, we're not going to have public blasphemy.
Right.
We aren't going to have public false preaching. And that was for two reasons. One, for outward peace and harmony in that community, whatever size it is. But also, two, very noticeably, because outward blasphemy, whether it be blasphemy laws or false preaching, that will call down the wrath of God. This is why he said, even in the early 1520s, we got to get rid of the sacrifice of the Mass. And he wanted those chapters and cloisters to get rid of it on their own. But when they were stubborn, he told Frederick the Wise, you better get it done.
Right.
He actually didn't care by what means. I mean,
right.
Within reason. But he was fine using...
whether it's church or state.
Church or state, yeah,
right.
Exactly. He wanted it done.
Right.
He did not want it done in a rebellious, radical fashion like a Münster or a Karlstadt, of course. It had to be done in good order. And then later on, you have him wanting the Anabaptists kicked out of the land, fined, imprisoned, even put to death if it was necessary, even though he wanted a more pastoral approach, if possible.
And if I remember right, because you talked about this on the podcast, it wasn't just an Anabaptist living there. It was an Anabaptist that began to preach or to teach their theology in such a way that persuaded others.
It was both.
This is the big concern is, and the third factor is he doesn't want people who are rightly believing to be
being
misled.
pulled away. Yeah,
exactly. And so you need to silence this false teaching when you can.
Right. But it's not just for the outward peace and harmony of the community. Right. Also, he's scared about, and rightfully so, we should all be fearful of this, of God's judgment being poured out if you tolerate blasphemy. So I guess to circle back around to the question, and I was going to push back a little bit, I would say, yeah, I would have no problem with a political jurisdiction saying you need to be in church every Sunday or whatever the details are under the right circumstances.
Okay.
Right now in America, that would not fly.
Right.
It would be counterproductive. It would be a bad move. But I would go back to Nebuchadnezzar. He doesn't say everyone's got to go worship at the temple in Jerusalem or the local synagogue or believe in the Lord. But at the same time, he says you can't blaspheme his name. So he is starting on that. It's very incremental. It's almost like a ratcheting effect. So I would say we still need to assert that possibility, but it's not something that you might want to go 0 to 60 on.
Yeah, right.
Out of wisdom.
And so the possibility, Luther Saxony is very different than American 21st century. And that's the realities we have to pay attention to. So the ideal, right, we're striving for this. Yeah. But what's reaching too far is when we start to be counterproductive in the very witness we're trying to give. Yeah. And that's when it's a problem.
And I agree with that. You got to be very careful in how you do it.
Let me ask the question to both of you on that. So you guys are agreed on that, but there's certainly a conglomerate out there that would really balk at that idea. So what would you say to, if I were to play that position and to say, there's no situation where the government should be telling people they have to be in church or they might be imprisoned or fined or something like that. How would you respond to them? Where they might say that's an overreach of Christianity.
I'd say quit being so American.
Yeah.
Or go read the preface to the catechisms. You know? I mean, when Luther says you have to come and learn our doctrine, I'm summarizing, obviously.
No, it's large catechism. Yeah. Anybody who's living in your household should know this stuff, whether he's a pagan or not.
Everybody in the community, and this goes
good for the community.
Yeah,
that's right.
And this is also reflected in Exodus 20 when you're talking about keeping the Sabbath. Who also is included?
Everybody.
Yeah, it's everybody.
Right.
It's your servants. It's your slaves.
Yeah, whether they believe it or not,
animals.
they should be exposed. They should be trained. Yeah. Luther's clear on this, and you don't feed them until they know this.
Exactly.
Stuff. So in other words, it matters, and it matters. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and that's that. The distinction between the two tables is real. I'm not denying it. But the more important distinction is the outward keeping and the
that's
inward
well said.
Keeping.
And the distinction between the tables is overplayed, frankly.
Yes, it is.
Way overplayed. The tables, all 10 commandments, or the 13, however you want to count them. The commandments basically are just expressing this is what it looks like to be a creature the way God intended. Yeah. And it involves your relationship with God and with your neighbor, and it all kind of rolls together. And so should a good government be interested in making sure that people are being good creatures? Yes, that's their job. That's what they should be doing. And what should determine justice? What should determine it is God's will. Now, the problem we get is people who are living in American 21st century have bought this idea that somehow, no. Freedom is key. And I can't impose. And so, because freedom is a core principle foundation we have to protect. And so I have to protect everybody's religious freedom. And for me to impose is in violating their religious freedom. This is an American weird notion. It's not a Lutheran one. It's not a Christian one. But see, this is where you get most of the pushback, is people have this innate sense of, well, it'd be wrong for me to force somebody to believe or force them to do something they don't believe in. But the reality is we do this all the time. I make my kids do stuff they don't feel like doing. That's what good parents do. It's called discipline. But the notion that somehow we have this inviolate free will that we can't impose on, that's a Baptist idea.
That's soul liberty.
It is soul liberty.
Yep.
It's a Baptist idea. And Jefferson buys it and it finds its way in and has become absolutely critical. It's a cornerstone of the American how we operate in America, but it's not Christian. And that's the biggest hurdle we have to get across, to help people realize, wait a minute, you mean that's not sacred? No, it's not sacred.
And if I could just play off of that very briefly, it's really interesting that when Jefferson gets Virginia to pass what becomes kind of the prototype of the First Amendment, he actually kind of, I think, purposefully and ironically frames it as not the disestablishment of religion, but the establishment of religious liberty. You're always going to have a religion. And the religion in America now, at least, once the Bill of Rights got incorporated on the state level, which is rather modern, by the way, but that's an establishment of religious liberty as a religion. And I think Jefferson knew exactly what he was doing.
No, I think so too.
Oh, absolutely. And you're always going to have a religion. It's not a question of whether you have one or not. It's which one do you have. You're always going to have blasphemy laws. The only question is which ones are you going to have?
No, we have blasphemy laws now, because the blasphemy law now is you can't violate somebody's inherent autonomy.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the religion of 21st century America is the sacred individual, and anything that violates that is wrong.
Yeah.
And so, it's not on the books, but some of it is even.
Yeah.
And you're right about that.
Well, and the rubber hits the road when you critique the American God of whether it be equality, liberty, whatever.
Individual autonomy.
Individual autonomy. You are going to pay a heavy price.
That's
Again,
right.
It might not be on the books stated as such, but you might lose your job.
Oh, yeah. The cancel culture will definitely do its job.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Okay. I've got maybe two areas. So I'm interested in this just to get real concrete.
Yeah.
And maybe Joel, I'll start with you on this one. So let's go back to COVID, for instance. This is an area where it's kind of the inverse. So it's less about kind of the assertion of Christianity, but it's about where do you draw the line when you are being asserted against.
Yeah.
Right. So, particularly there was a lot of conversations that came out of certainly the US, but it was more extreme in Canada. And within the Lutheran Church, there was a lot of debate around this. And there's been some things that have been published publicly, and there's been a lot of conversation around it. So, when you're looking at something like the situation with COVID, where they come in and they say, you cannot gather and worship, right? So it's the inverse of that. Rather than saying you must go to worship, they're saying you can't. Or like you cannot bring communion to somebody who is unvaccinated. Okay. And there were those within the church that really pushed, and let's just even take away kind of the naivety of that first month. That's not what we're getting at. We're saying kind of a prolonged stance that says, well, we have to kind of listen to the government on not gathering or not bringing communion to somebody who is unvaccinated, right? So with that kind of concrete, what do we do there?
The whole pandemic is fascinating. We're going to be studying that for decades. There are so many PhDs ready to be written on that whole thing because there's so many things to observe and rethink about. But I think by and large, we mishandled it in huge ways. And this idea of we just have to be obedient to the government. Yeah, Paul tells us to be obedient to government. But we also have to be obedient to what it means to follow Christ. And so in a national emergency, can you not worship for a while? Yeah, probably. A few weeks, months? No. And so are we going to start finding a way to worship? Of course. Why? Because we're Christian. It's what we do. And are we going to make sure people are being cared for spiritually? Yeah, it's what we do. And do we stop doing that because we have to obey government? Absolutely not. And so I think we made some huge missteps there. And it was kind of a quick reaction of we have to show love to people, and that means doing the careful thing. And the whole idea of, the most important thing is your physical health. That's just wrong. And the idea of the loving thing is to back off. We have to be careful about our witness. That plays into it a little bit. That's why there's some, I'm not trying to be wishy-washy here, but okay, I can obey the government for a while. We'll back off. But this is not going to become a new way of life. It's not going to become how we operate. Because we are Christian, we do things like we worship together. This is what we do, and we'll find a way to do it. And then you start getting creative. And there were guys who were creative and found a way to do it. But the idea of, no, we just have to obey the government. No, we will do what we need to do, whether the government lets us or not. We do what we do.
Yeah, I think I would agree with all of that. I don't think that's a point of disagreement between us.
Okay. Let's go to move to the third point then. And I think this one, a lot of things I think come into here. So this might in many ways be the heart. Okay. So this is the question of the use of force and Christian witness. And maybe to kind of, there's a couple things I have here, but to go back to something, Joel, you said at the beginning, you were talking in kind of your opening statements, I forget which one of the points it was, but about kind of a concern about imposing Christian values versus, I forget the way you put it, but, kind of sharing, right? Yeah. So this imposition. So that's going to be kind of the core of this area is to what degree should we impose things?
And this is where it gets interesting because, see, I would agree with David that can you force somebody to do something even if they don't want to? Of course. And can you make them do the right thing because it's the moral thing? Of course. And is that okay to do? Yeah. If you've got the votes, if you've got the people who are on side with it, or if it's kind of the where we're going, you can do that. Should you? That's where it gets more interesting. And what the government decides to do and what the church encourages the government to do maybe are two different things. So if I've got a government who says, like Nebuchadnezzar, okay, I want to pass a law here. You're the king. Do whatever you want, dude. You want to do that? Great. I think that's awesome. But in America, it's kind of different because now we have to use the power of the vote and use the power of our politics. And the concern I have is that when we start getting focused on the coercion and trying to make things happen, even though they might be good things, we end up, again, back to the counterproductive thing, we make the church look like a bully, or we make it look like a special interest group trying to get their way. You don't force your morality on my body. And we've heard that ad nauseum. But see, that's how it gets read. Even though, is it right for you not to kill your baby? Yeah. Will you be better off not having an abortion? Yeah, in so many ways. And do I know that? Yeah, I know that because God's word says so. And so can I enforce that on you? Yes. Would it be better if we didn't have allow people to live gay lifestyles? Yeah, I think that'd be better, frankly. Whether you're infringing on their freedom, they don't have freedom to violate God's law. That's just the reality. So would it be better if we could have laws against those things? Sure. But we have to then look at where we are as a culture, where we are as a country, and what is going to happen to the church's ability to witness God's reality of Christ and his forgiveness and his love if we start taking strong stands on that, which is why the whole, not to use a flashpoint straw man, but they're real, is the whole the Westboro Baptists, And so what everybody know about them? They hate gay people. They're obnoxious, they're offensive, they're horrible people. And then they associate that with Christianity. And we think, they're not Christianity. And yet that's what people see and hear. And so while that's an extreme thing, that's my concern about Christian nationalist kind of ideas too often get read as we're just being bullies. We're just another special interest group. And when the church, I would contend, acts like one more special interest group trying to fight for something, we end up diminishing the church.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm totally agreed that we need to be prudent about it.
Okay.
Where I'll throw something out and maybe this will help get some grist for the grind.
All right.
I think that all of the major, let's just say magisterial reformed Christian nationalists of any prominence would totally agree about your point about prudence. Okay. I don't know much about the charismatic ones because that's more folk. Mm-hmm. The Catholic integralists, they actually talk a lot about prudence too. Mm-hmm. And so I guess even while we would agree on it needs to be incremental and it needs to be prudent and sensitive to the circumstances and politics is the art of the possible, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think that I can sense I'm much more okay about having a prudent yet also aggressive, active desire to get stuff done.
Yeah, okay. And that aggressive, active desire, I think, is probably where the problem starts to come in.
Okay.
What's that look like? What are you trying to do? And what is the church's reputation? What is the church portraying to the community around us, to our own people? What are we portraying about what it means to be Christian and how we go about it?
And I agree with that. I'm totally sensitive to that.
All right.
And I think that I can't speak for them, but I think that the, Reformed and the Catholic Christian nationalists would agree with that.
Okay.
That we need to be careful about that.
Yeah,
and keep first things first.
Yeah.
But I guess I would point to the scriptural examples of Daniel with Nebuchadnezzar and then later Cyrus.
Yeah.
I would point to, that's the preeminent example, Daniel. But but also properly ordered magistrates who are aggressive on getting rid of paganism or evil life. There is an active sense of let's get done what can get done.
Amen. And I totally agree with that. Let's get done what can get done, and who's doing it. And so, so if a Christian wants to let's do this for the sake of God's morality, for the sake of the world, absolutely. We should all be doing that. We should, in other words, I should vote for those kinds of things. I vote for those kinds of candidates. I should be encouraging my people to think about these kinds of things and not just be kind of following the American way of, celebrating freedom and enhancing freedom. No, we should be enhancing God's morality. I agree with you.
So you would, just to clarify, you would not disagree. I mean, let's throw out the word aggressive because that might have some negative connotations, but a very active understanding of let's advance how far the Word of God predominates in our society. With the possible pitfalls. Being aware.
And wait, I want to come back and talk about Christendom at some point.
Sure.
Just because we were talking a little bit last night, even and thinking about some of this, the pick your poison sort of thing. We'll come back to that. But should Christians be actively engaged in making the world the best it can possibly be? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I believe that our theology as Lutherans should make us some of the most socially active people that there are. We don't have that heritage, which is weird.
At least not in America. But
in America we don't have that heritage, but we should be socially active. And that doesn't mean just for conservative values, but it means for God's truth, for God's reality, fighting for God's justice. And, people kind of get squeamish about, you're a social justice warrior. Well, I'm going to fight for justice, but God's going to define it, not what, commonly people feel or what, the Enlightenment defines justice. Mm-hmm. Justice is defined by God, which is what adheres to his word. So yes, do I want God's word being advanced? Yes. Do I want God's morality being advanced? Yes. Would I love it if we could start having a law that says no more billboards that are, sorted and
anti-pornography laws.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That'd be great. And so I think we should pray for those things and work for those things. But is that my first task? And that's where we start getting into, what role does it play in the integration of the estates? That's where
that's why I think the Lutheran conversation needs to be upped. And that's why I made it one of my 4 points about this conversation, not just here, but within Lutheranism in America is so important.
I agree.
Because the voices right now, whether it be folk or Catholic or Reformed, I think would be the closest to magisterial or Reformed.
Yeah.
I know there's differences, but generally speaking, our voices need to be heard on this, because if we don't advance what we understand to be the truth, which is the truth, then we're going to leave the field to other people.
Amen.
Okay.
No, I completely agree with you. I am not advocating quietism.
Yeah. I'm
not advocating a pulling back. Like I said, circling the wagons. That's wrong. That's our first instinct.
Yeah.
Pull back, the lake will be gone, quiet Lutherans,
Sure.
You never say anything, don't call any attention. While we don't need to call attention, we also can't forsake the field. But we have to be careful what we're doing in that field then.
Can I offer a friendly critique then? Mm-hmm. And that'll get into something specific. And that is, I went back and watched I think it was 2023 or 24 symposia.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Essay at the symposium, at the CSL symposium. And your paper was Christian Nationalism, and I don't remember the
Star-Spangled Banner.
Star-Spangled Banner. Okay, yeah,
Star-Spangled
sure.
Luther.
That was clever. Yeah.
That's good.
I never care about titles, but you guys always come up with clever titles.
My wife always tells me you have terrible titles.
Oh, really?
She comes up with titles.
No.
That one
I do remember. That's clever.
Yeah, that one I liked.
So, because I know we need grist for the grind here, you, and I know I'm paraphrasing, but I think fairly, correct me if I'm wrong, but you kind of laid out the doctrine of the two realms.
Yeah.
And then at the end, I don't remember exactly how you slid into it, but you basically made the assertion, and therefore any talk of Christian nationalism is an absurdity, or Christian nation is no good. And I don't think that's a helpful way to talk about it. Okay. I agree with all of your, hey, there's pitfalls here, there's temptations there, there's idols waiting in the wings. I agree with all of that. But I don't think rejecting which you obviously don't reject the idea of the ideal that I've been presenting, but at the same time, I think the Christian nationalist debate is important. So I have a hard time hearing this is an absurdity.
Okay. The absurdity is the idea that somehow we can make this happen, that this is the goal. And I hear too much of this rhetoric coming from those kinds of, we're going to make a Christian America. Well, what do you mean by that? What does this mean to you?
And who are you talking about?
Again, I'm talking about probably the folk versions of these things.
Okay.
The kinds of stuff you encounter on the 4th of July's and national holidays and that kind of stuff. And that's my concern. So is it fair? And if you're going to define Christian nationalism as we should be striving for a country that adheres to God's will, I won't disagree with that.
Right.
No. And if that's how we're defining Christian nationalism, yeah. But that's not how I don't think a lot of our people hear it that way necessarily.
Can I give some concretes? I think that might be helpful just to kind of
sure,
get
yeah.
to. So, and maybe in each of these you can kind of think of, is that an ideal? And then second, because I think all of these are ones that you could be actively working towards. So in other words, should we as the church be actively working in this? So I'll lay the 4 out, and I'd kind of like to hear because they're.
Can I actually clarify something before you go on?
Yeah, go for it.
Obviously, when the church works, they work. Every Christian works individually and corporately. But I just want to understand that whatever you ask, when you say the church, it's not necessarily the official synod or something, but Christians properly working it out according to their own vocations. Yeah.
In the same way, maybe not to the same degree, but in a close second degree, we are all united around a certain confession. And should that confession then lead to kind of all of us, should we all be agreed on like these should be active goals that we're working towards? Not saying LCMS Inc. creates a task force or Trinity Lutheran Church picks up the banner, but
the task force never do anything. So.
Well, that's true.
It's not quite.
You said it.
Yeah.
No, that's why we have them.
Yeah.
Looks good on paper.
So here's a couple examples. So, kind of immigration is certainly a question here that's being like actively discussed in our country, right?
Yep.
And it is very fair to say, and we've talked with, even on the podcast, we've talked with some kind of missionary types that are in the Twin Cities, in certain areas that have been overtaken by Muslim populations. And they will say without a doubt, you go to convert the Muslims and you always lose, and they actually end up converting a lot of your people. Like they're very militant on this. So there's no doubt that if I did not live here in Waconia, but I lived 25 miles east, that there would be a real danger of my children, people in my church and in my community being converted to Islam, right? And it's also true, therefore, that if we tomorrow sent all the Muslims back to the country that they came from, wherever that is, that threat to our own people would be taken away, right? So our children would be much safer, okay? So my question is, maybe we can just start with that one and then we can go down to some of these other ones. But like for that one, is that something that, that we should be really having a conversation with? Of course we want to evangelize, but that question is that something that we should be thinking about too, as we're kind of shipping people with other ideologies into our communities that are changing both the moral and the theological structure? And I'll start with you, Joel.
Oh, you're going to start with me? Okay. I hadn't thought about that specific instance. But I thought about the immigration thing and the whole idea of, what is it, what are we trying to create, a perfect kind of world. So my first reaction is that I'm not afraid of Islam, and I don't think we need to be afraid of the interaction with them. God's truth wins out. Now, can people be very compelling and, the social interactions and the personal interactions matter? Sure. But as a parent and as a pastor, I think there are plenty of things I can do in a predominantly Muslim context I'm not be afraid by that. And so my second thought would be, is the solution to ship them all home? No. I tend to be very against the idea of kind of clamping down borders for the sake of preserving our American heritage, whatever that is. I think that's a little bit misguided. So I'm not a huge fan of that whole mentality, because I think, and I'm not saying let them in so we can evangelize them. I'm not under any illusions about how easy that's going to be. But I do know that God calls us to witness to those who are around us, and whoever shows up around me, I will witness God's truth to them, and however I can do that, whether I'm surrounded by a Muslim context, or I have just one Muslim neighbor, or I'm living in prison, or wherever I happen to be in my context, I witness to God's reality without fear. So no, I'm not a huge fan of, clamping down on immigration laws to try to make a safer country for my kids or other my parishioners.
Okay. And the reason I use that example, just to kind of clarify, and then Dave, if you want to go, but one, I'm thinking of the Luther with the Anabaptists.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of like what would a modern day situation for that look like. And then just knowing some of the, I mean, you can see it more so in Britain, but certainly in Minneapolis, close to here, like there's areas where Christendom has been
but the difference is, though, Luther's living in a little city in a Saxon state where it is Christian. Everybody, the prince is Christian. They're all, and the question is, are you Lutheran or Baptist or Catholic? But they're all kind of there. And so Luther's saying, for the sake of unity, which was still valued a lot then, we don't see it the same way anymore since the Peace of Augsburg. That's changed that. But he's living in a state where, we need to do this for the sake of everybody. We don't live there. And so should we be striving for that? I think it hurts our witness when we start trying to fight for those kinds of laws.
Okay. Dave?
Yeah, this is probably a good point of difference because I would first, of course, say that a question like that is going to depend on circumstances, and it is a matter of wisdom. The particular solutions, Christians of goodwill can disagree on that. Yet at the same time, I guess I would still hold as an ideal Luther's understanding of territorialism, which was common back in that day. We're so far away from that that would be a generational project, unless a situation
generations probably.
Unless there's new circumstances and big shakeups. Politically,
collapse of Western culture.
Yeah, sure. Which who knows? So right. I mean, but I still would assert that territorialism is the ideal, and I also do think that we have to take seriously Luther and I would say the Scriptures' understanding of if you tolerate public open blasphemy, you are going to call down God's curses. Not to mention, I know that this is mixing apples and oranges to a certain extent, but the Israelites did not send their kids to Canaanite schools. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
right.
They did not say, hey, and I know you're not saying this, but they did not say, let's have more Canaanites or Moabites or Ammonites immigrate to our country so we can evangelize them. I mean, that's like suicidal, basically. So I personally think it is certainly within the realm of Christian discourse to say, hey, as a Christian people, or at least as a formerly Christian people, or people that are looking towards a renewed Christendom, what should we do with people who refuse to outwardly conform and are uttering wicked blasphemies and committing pagan crime? Well, not pagan, but immoral crimes against the populace here.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, then the question is, what do you mean by formerly Christian? What is, who's passing this law for what reason?
Oh, absolutely.
And is it just racially motivated, jingoistic kind of, American supreme, preserving our American thing? All those things get rolled into this.
Yeah,
and so
certainly.
As a Christian, my goal is always to say, how do I witness God's reality the best way I can in the context?
Absolutely. And there's lots of both legitimate points on that, you know what I mean? In terms of what is the ethnic makeup of a community? Is that, is there too much plurality for cohesion? That's a legitimate topic for Christians.
That's a legitimate question.
Yeah. There's also motivation, like you said. Is it just jingoistic? Is it reaching back for something that never existed?
Right.
Or is it actually, hey, these are these circumstances. These are just outward horrible things. And even if we were formerly a broadly speaking Christian people, we're still seeking to recover that. I think those are all legitimate discussions, and they need to also be done with the eye of not just how do we give a good witness to the non-Christians, but how do we protect our own people? I agree with Professor Biermann about, I'm not scared about debating Muslims. I totally agree with that. Yet at the same time, if a religious population is committing crimes, like in Britain. Britain is the classic example with the Muslim rape gangs.
Well, that's a different issue altogether.
Sure. But I mean, the Somalis, I'm assuming that's what we're talking about in Minneapolis, have brought incredible amounts of crime. And I think that's something where you say, hey, yes, we need to bear a good witness, but also we need to give a good witness to our children, our grandchildren. And so I do think preserving not just an orderly society, but a more Christian society is important.
Well, orderly society, absolutely. That's government's job. As far as a Christian society, well, what do you mean by Christian? And that's where we need to get on to talking about Christendom a little bit,
sure.
And what that actually means by that. And we'll get there, I'm sure. But see, the church's ideal is every race, tribe, and nation all come together under the confession of Jesus as Lord. And so the idea that we need to preserve our ethnicity, there's something to be said for being the cohesion that comes from living life together. And, having the same holidays, the same ways of operating. When you have people have different holiday celebrations, it's weird. It creates dissonance. And yet in the church, we find our unity around our common confession of Christ. That's what brings us together. And so to me, the Christian ideal that we're striving for is not a homogenization of everybody into an American way of being, but the ability to be able to say, look, these different languages, these different cultures, these different music styles, these different ways of living, these different ways of dressing, these are all part of God's wonderful creation. And we can all delight in these things together under the unity of our common confession of Christ.
And I agree with that. I just don't, and I know you are big into not over-realizing eschatology.
Right.
And so, but here in this life, these are legitimate discussions about how much diversity can happen in one community.
And how much plurality can you allow before you start to disintegrate it.
Right.
And we're living in the disintegration. I agree with that.
Yeah, because any pluralistic society ultimately winds up as a rather unified, homogenous society.
Correct.
Over time.
Or it's not going to survive.
Yeah. So I think those are all legitimate questions. So I guess to answer your question directly, obviously, how would you do this? How would you make criteria? All that kind of stuff is very complex. But in terms of a Christian people, again, whatever that means, but a Christian people saying, listen, we are going to draw the line and say, if you are a Muslim, I know there's lots of prudential steps to get there, but to say, hey, if you're a Muslim, either you need to convert or you need to leave. I think that's totally on the table. It's not on the table right here and right now necessarily. Yeah. I don't think it's off the table in terms of discussing. I mean, Spain had to deal with this.
Well, no, it did. But see, I think that would be off the table. I wouldn't want that. To say because you are a Muslim, you can't live here. I don't think that would be
in all circumstances. There's no circumstance where that would
I have a hard time thinking of a time when I would say that's a good thing to do.
Well, I mean, let's use Spain.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think Spain had good reason to do that. I mean, the Muslims were cooperating with Muslim pirates from North Africa, raiding, enslaving people on the Mediterranean coast.
And see, but then now you're into order issues. And it's not just an issue of because of your faith you're doing this, but it's because of what your actions.
But they're kind of intertwined.
They do. No one is an isolated thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And they all get intertwined. But I think we need to be careful that we make sure we're doing it for the order, morality reasons and not for the ethnic kinds of reasons.
Well, I'm bringing up the blasphemy issue.
The blasphemy issue. And see, and that's where, and yes, it would be great if we could have keep people from doing what is wrong, even in the first table.
Yeah.
Right. But again, do I exile them or kick them out? I'd be really reluctant to start being too aggressive in that. I'd have to look at the circumstances and think about what's happening morally, what's happening for the sake of the community.
I think all of those topics are, and we talked a little bit yesterday and before about maybe a generational difference. But like, just to throw out kind of an example, like when I hear about a 50-foot golden statue of a Hindu god or goddess, in Texas, you know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, that to me puts those questions on the table.
Okay.
In the call to prayers, I'm almost positive, Bennett, you might know too, but I'm pretty sure the call to prayer is now the Muslim
it's being
actively done in Minneapolis on whatever day. So that's right. So those are tangible things that people have to look at and say, one, does that bring the wrath of God? So, I mean, so this sounds like this is an area where just to correct, Joel, you're saying this is something that's off the table, and you're saying this is something.
I'm saying that a Christian nation, however we particularly define that, it's totally on the table of discussion, whether it's possible at the moment or not, to talk about cohesion, whether it be along ethnic or religious lines, but also to talk about there is open blasphemy that is not just endangering our children, both in a peace and order way, but also in a religious way. And not only is it breaking up cohesion in our culture and among our people, but also it is perhaps going to bring down the wrath of God.
Well, bringing down the wrath of God, I know you've mentioned that a few times, and I'm not sure what we talking about. Hurricane Katrina there, the wrath of God.
No, I'm not talking
that
about
could
like
happen.
that. Even though that might be. Who knows? Yeah.
It might be. And will God judge each of us for what we've done or not done? Absolutely. And so are we accountable? But I would contend, I don't think I'm accountable for my country or my nation state, allowing immigration. And now we have somebody who's worshiping a false god or a false religion next to mine, that now I'm somehow accountable for that. I'm not sure I would agree with that.
I'm not saying maybe.
I wouldn't agree with that.
I wouldn't say that you are personally solely accountable, of course.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that, and again, it's different because we do live in a representative form of government,
right.
and that complicates everything like
it
that.
Does.
But I do think that you have the clear witness of the scriptures where what you can do to diminish public blasphemy, you should do. And then that's why all these things are on the table.
And that's where the can do. What does that mean? What does that mean? And how far do we go? And what's happening?
That's why I brought up the Spanish example. Because they could do it.
That's fair. And should the church say, but wait a minute, these are people who are hearing the gospel, or they could hear the gospel, they stay here. See, that's where it gets a little more complicated. And that's where back to the estate of the church is here to declare the forgiveness of Christ to every single person and bring them to Christ.
And I admit that that's very complicated.
Yeah.
Because there are competing concerns.
Right.
But I do think that, again, to go back to the Spanish example, I have Spanish heritage, so I love Spanish history. So I'm kind of wrapped
I'll
up
yield
in
to
this.
you on that one.
Well, but I mean, you don't have to be an expert, which I'm certainly not, to assert, which I'm going to do. I think they were wise to do that because they balanced
when was this happening? What century are you talking? This is
this is after Ferdinand and Isabella are able to unite Spain, kick out conquer Granada, and then there's an expulsion
and reestablish.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that yes, there were some peace and order concerns because these people are helping out the Muslim pirates.
I'm with you on that.
But it's not just because of that. It's also because they take seriously what I think the Old Testament kings did, and Luther, when he's writing to the rulers, you have to take this seriously. You have a duty towards God.
And that context, when you've got Isabella as a king and the queen this is their realm, and they can do that. Yeah, okay. They can do that.
And the way I would translate that to America is, we don't have a king who can just do that. Right. But let's be honest, kings couldn't just do that if they didn't build popular support among nobles and barons and whatnot.
Agreed.
And I would say the American context is certainly different, but it's not that different because we still have our elites, know? And even as individual citizens, I think that whether you choose thinking about it in a prudent way, that is a good goal, I think it's on the table for Christians to say maybe it would be good.
And we can talk about it.
Yeah.
That's that. Yeah.
The argument to prove that is another case, but I think that's on the table.
And how do you change the world? You get the James Davison Hunters, the argument about faithful presence kind of thing. And I'm kind of sympathetic to that idea as well, rather than legislating the change.
Let me give one more example here. And this is going to backtrack on that one was pretty hyperbolic, right? I mean, especially saying like, hey, tomorrow. So, I mean, it's good. And I think we found kind of a distinction there. So this one's a little bit easier. So I'm interested to hear like if something like this would be much more on the table. So for instance, one issue is pornography, right? And that's a big issue. And, when you look at pornography, and many people have said this openly, it's like, no, anyone that's engaging in that, not just watching, but some states have, they've tried to put barriers where certain things can't be accessed within their state or whatnot, because there's this recognition that this is something so potent and addictive that it's really harming the citizen. And then obviously from a Christian perspective, it's harming the spiritual health of, the Christian that's engaging in something like this. Should we be advocating for something like anyone that continues to make pornography or fund pornography, etc., like should be imprisoned? Is that something that we should be advocating for? And once again, I'm not
I'd be in favor of that.
Yeah, I have no problem with that.
Okay. Yeah,
again, it depends on the circumstance. I mean, but I mean, you hear about some civil magistrates in other countries that sometimes things are so bad and the disease is so spread everywhere that you have to take pretty serious measures to change stuff. I can't remember the name of the guy in the Philippines, but he basically made like I don't remember if
Duarte?
It was Duarte. Yeah. I mean, again, don't fact check me on this, but he had a very serious penalty for anybody dealing marijuana.
Right.
Because it was just so rampant.
Right.
And some people were like, this is crazy. It's not just in the sense of proportionality to the crime, but if it's endemic and so bad, I think that's totally on the table. Or like, what's his name? Bukele down in El Salvador. I mean, he's really romping and stomping, and he's turned his country into a very, very safe way, into a very, very safe place. I think that stuff is on the table, especially with pornography. I mean,
yeah, no, I'd agree. I have no problem with criminalizing pornography.
Mm-hmm. What about the death penalty?
Death penalty? You mean to use the death penalty for pornographers?
Yeah.
Well, it has to be proportionate. So I would say it might not be proportionate.
It would depend on how bad and how horrible the violation.
What kind of crimes they've done.
How many times they've violated it. I wouldn't put it off the table, but we'd have to talk about specifics about.
The death penalty is always a possibility for any crime that fits the. So I'm not anti-death penalty, but be judicious in your use of it.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and we'll take a break, and then we've got 2 more topics to get into, and that will get us right into Christendom, which I know that you are ready to jump at. So, all right.
Awesome.
All right. Good.
All right. And Bennett says we're back. And so we're going to jump here into kind of our 4th subcategory, and that's going to be, we can just call it Christendom.
All right.
Okay.
At last.
Yes, at last. So, Joel, you take us away. I know you've been excited for this.
Well, Christendom is this notion of we're going to live in a Christian world, and government and the country and the family and the church are all together in this thing. And it looks on paper like a great thing. And it's kind of what Luther was living in. We talked a lot about Luther's Saxony. That'd be a great example of Christendom. So you've got the prince, and you've got all society, all the family, all the church, all working on the same direction. We all know who God is. We all are worshiping the same things. We're all following the same thing. So that would be what Christendom looks like. Okay. And so Christendom is, in a sense, the ideal. It's kind of what David would be talking about. This is what we're shooting for, a world that's built around God's word. And on paper, this is great. This is what we want. Christendom, though, and this gets back to my opening statement about we have to deal with the realities of a broken world and of broken, fallen people, and then kind of come to terms with what that looks like. Because Christendom has rarely given the results we want it to give, has never produced the kind of, we've got it, now we're not so thrilled with it. And that's kind of what I was talking about picking your poison. So right now we're living in 21st century America, where we've got liberal self-expression, autonomous individuals going bonkers. And we see, Sixth Commandment violated at every turn. And we see all these horrible things happening. And the First Commandment, Second Commandment violated at every turn, and pornography and gay stuff, and everything's just going crazy. And it's horrible. And, I keep on talking about billboards, because there's huge billboards in St. Louis. Find out who the father is, It's like, and this, get your baby tested to find out who the dad is. And thinking, do I want my grandkids reading this? What's that even mean? You don't need to know. It's just a crazy world we're living in. So that's horrible. But Christendom, then we say, well, that's the ideal. And yet Christendom has its problems as well. So it's in a matter of kind of pick your poison. And this has been the famous argument against Constantinianism, which is sort of a close cousin to Christendom. The idea of Constantinianism is this nice, happy cooperation between church and state, which existed from Constantine all through the Middle Ages, and then starts collapsing in the Western culture, especially, in the 20th century. We see it kind of undoing itself. And that's a whole nother discussion in itself. And I don't want to get derailed by that and, picking that all apart. But the point I would like to make is, Christendom doesn't always accomplish all that we'd hope it to. And even Luther famously complained about, there's only 1 in 1,000 are real Christians. Everybody else is just playing games. And so the tendency to hypocrisy, the tendency to people not taking things seriously, the tendency to just kind of play along, it's real. Luther complained about that bitterly. Then you get a couple centuries later, you get Soren Kierkegaard with his famous attack upon Christendom, which is just scathing in his rebuke, and he's spot on in his criticisms of, here's what happens when you have a socialized church. Here's what happens when you have the state on board. Everybody becomes superficial. You get people playing games, and you don't actually have genuine Christianity being lived out again. And that's the usual concern about most people who are critical of Constantinianism is it even Christian anymore? And is Christendom even Christian? And I think that's a fair critique. that Christendom starts to look more like a way of life, or more like propping up a conservative value, or propping up an ideal for a way that we think we should live, instead of people actually following Christ and doing what that looks like. And so Christendom might seem like a good goal, but when it's been achieved, it's rarely achieved what we think it should be. It's rarely delivered what people would hope it would deliver. So that's my concern with Christendom.
Yeah, my response would be to echo what I said in my opening statement, that I agree with all of those points, that there's a lot of pitfalls. I agree with you. Pick your poison.
All right.
Do you have people who are falling away because of outward pressure, being swamped by the world or false doctrine or whatnot? Or do you have people who are just going along to get along under some type of Christian nation or Christendom? And that does lead to a lot of hypocrisy. And of course, any Christendom, any Christian nation or community has always struggled with that. I guess I would say, if I had to pick a poison, I would pick that one.
Right.
I certainly would.
Okay.
And not just for the reasons that I think a lot of people, especially young people, say. I would rather live in a hypocritical America of 100 years ago, or hypocritical Lutheran Saxony, because at least we have good outward Christian morals to a further extent than the atrocities we see today. But I think that a deeper reason of why I would pick that poison, knowing that there is going to be problems, is because, it's kind of cliche to say, but you win by winning. And I think that at least the government outwardly upholding the 10 Commandments, in this outward fashion, is going to be better. And I would boil it back down to a family example.
Okay.
So my children, if they don't want to go to church, I still make them go.
Yeah.
I know you would agree with this.
Yep.
And I know that there is a distinction between internally in the family and then at society at large. I get that.
Yeah.
However, if I had a child who just did not want to go to church, I know that he is dragging his feet and he is kind of hypocritical. It's just surface level stuff.
Yeah.
I would still rather have him being exposed to preaching, going there, and hopefully the word doing its work. And of course, I can be active in that as well. And I guess I would apply that same basic principle to the society at large.
Okay.
And so I'm not naive about the potential pitfalls or the greater chance of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Yet I do think that at least the math is simple to me. I'd rather have the government, the state, the magistrates, whatever it may be, that estate doing what it should be doing than not doing what it's doing.
Okay.
You're going to have pitfalls and poison on either side.
Right.
So you might as well take the good instead of saying, well, the government is just lost. I know that's not what you're saying, but I would rather be under Christendom, as imperfect as it's always going to be and always has expressed itself, than not, because that's closer in line with the ideal.
Yeah, maybe. But see, then I would counter with, if you're living in a decadent culture, you know exactly what it means to be Christian. And now to follow Christ comes with a price, and you're getting serious about it, and it actually enhances it. And one of the greatest examples is in the early church, when the church is under huge pressure and all kinds of, and it's not legal. I'm talking about the first and second centuries. What's the church do? It's grows because this is the church. We're following Christ. We know what we're about here. We're not just going along with society. We're not just playing the game. And see, my concern with Christendom or Constantinianism is it, in a sense, undercuts the actual confession of Christ. And I would say the gospel gets lost. And now we're back to what is the task of the church? What is our number one task? Proclaim Christ, help people to follow Christ. And you know this even now, even in our own LCMS, how many Christian families who come to church even weekly are actually serious about living the Christian life zealously, in their families and actually doing this. It's usually you can count them on one hand, your families that are just that committed and willing to make the hard choices. Like, no, we're not going to do sports because that's going to interfere with my Christian child's spiritual formation. Not many families willing to make those kinds of commitments. And so I think it becomes even harder to have the clarity of what it means to live the Christian life in a Christendom kind of world.
Yeah, and I do think that I guess to me that there are dangers on both sides, and I think the early church is a good example. There was the huge critique, especially among the monastics or proto-monastics, when all these people flow into the church, and now nobody takes it seriously.
Right.
You know, that's the classic example. I appreciate it, but I would point out that during the persecutions, yes, there were many faithful martyrs.
Yeah.
There are many people who died for the faith.
They're
and
also apostate.
There were tons. And yeah, you know where I'm going.
Yeah.
I would much rather, I would take a very positive view of Constantinianism, because to me, it's like, it is a picking of a poison. If you have the church assaulted by the world, you have some advantages, you have some clarity, but you have other pitfalls, and people do apostatize. If you do have Constantinianism, it could become an idol. The church and the state could become overly comfy, and you lose the church critiquing the state.
That's the huge problem.
But I view those as very equal pitfalls. Okay. And so I would rather have the good with Constantinianism, knowing that you're going to have poison with both.
All right.
You might as well take something.
Yeah. I'll take the no Constantinianism. But no, seriously, because I think the church being the church is the better thing to go with.
Even though you have said, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that the ideal would be Luther Saxony.
An ideal would be every single person following Christ.
Yeah.
And is Luther Saxony doing that? I think Luther himself would say, not even close.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Point taken. Yeah. Let me rephrase it. Even though you have said that the ideal is that every person following Christ, and that the rulers and citizenry, according to their Christian vocations, are actually...
That would be awesome.
Okay.
That'd be awesome.
But that's Constantinianism.
Well, yeah. And there's a story apocryphal about Stanley Hauerwas, who hates Constantinianism. Yeah. But he was in some little place. I think I mentioned this to you guys earlier, but he was in some little town in Ireland, and he happened to be there when there was a confirmation Sunday, and the whole town shuts down, and everybody comes to church, and everybody's there, and everybody's together on the same page with the stuff. And he made the comment, "If this is Constantinianism, I'm all for it."
Yeah.
And because that's the idea. It can look good. It can be a beautiful thing, but it's so rare and so unusual. And probably it happens best. You talked about the territorialism, or, the kind of, I'm drawing a blank on my terminology here. Anyway, the idea that, the local thing is where it needs to happen.
Yeah.
I'm totally with that. Yeah, that's the ideal, and that would be a good thing. And do I want everybody to know Christ? And wouldn't it be awesome if all the families in my neighborhood that my kids were playing with all had the same agenda I did, and all went to the same church, and went to the same church, and all valued the same things, and all were trying to raise their kids to follow Christ? That'd be awesome.
Yeah,
I won't complain.
Because I think that is an inherent desire of a rightly formed Christian.
Sure,
and
sure,
but. That's Constantinianism.
Yeah, no. It might be Christendom.
Okay, fine, whatever.
Yeah. Constantinianism
to you has certain illusions of.
Yeah. I'm not convinced Constantine was that sincere.
That's all another
I know.
I think he was.
I think his mom and sister probably were, but I'm not so sure about Constantine himself. So. Okay. He was pretty.
He's a hero of mine, so I'm just. He is.
He's not mine.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
He was a good warrior, no doubt about that. And he knew how to read the signs of the times. He was a great, sharp politician, no doubt about that. Yeah.
All right, couple questions here. Let's go. So I'll direct this one to you, Dave.
Sure.
Because I think the point of the thriving, Joel, that you're making, kind of that thriving nature. I think we've talked about this. David Peterson's talked about this. Peter Scare's talked about this. So Peter Scare will talk about at the seminary. He's hyper impressed with kind of, the last 6-7 years, the kind of guys that are coming. Okay. And David Peterson will talk about in his church, and I could attest to this here as well. And you might be able to as well. Like the young families that are coming, families that are under 35. One, the guys are on fire in a way that they have not been in a long time. And there's objective data to show that as well as anecdotal. And one of the reasons that happens is because when they're going into seminary, it's not just something you do, right? It's not just like, well, this is a nice, respectful thing to go to. You're like, well, I'm not going to be respected for it, but I'm going to do this because I've got kind of a feisty nature, because I can see the distinction between Christianity and this fallen world around us, right? So it does create this new vigor. And Joel, I think that's kind of part of your point, and that's why, Dave, I want to hear yours of, the blood of the martyrs,
it's the seed of the church.
It's the seed of the church, and you can see that anecdotally now. So is there some value in, obviously you'd say there is some value, but, I just want to hear kind of your thoughts on that point of Joel's playing out today, where we are seeing a heightened vigor because of the fallen world around us.
Yeah, not only are there disadvantages under Constantinianism or Christendom, whatever you want to call it, versus a beleaguered church. You know what I mean? There's advantages and disadvantages on both sides. But absolutely true, one of the advantages when you have a beleaguered church is the clarity is there, and you do have sometimes a renewed vigor. However, I would not only recognize that and admit that, but also say the guys who are gung-ho, especially the huge number of specifically young men, who are not just going to the seminary and are on fire for being a serious Christian, but also the stats, as you alluded to, there is a return to the church of specifically young men. That's a whole nother topic. I actually did a presentation out in Wyoming. It was called Saving the Sons of Missouri, on how do we reach out to not only our own young men who are reinvigorated, but also young men who are coming out of not just other Christian traditions, but out of kind of just nothing American beliefs and being interested in confessional Lutheranism. But I would note that even though they have this vigor, they also are very interested in, broadly speaking, Christendom or Christian nationalism. I think there's a big generational divide. And while admitting the pitfalls or potential idolatry inherent in this, at the same time, I would rather have a guy in whatever vocation, in whatever estate, being a little bit too gung-ho. So I'll throw it out that way. Okay. I'd rather have somebody be too gung-ho, and you can smooth that off, soften the edges, make them be more prudent and careful, and be aware of these temptations, than someone who is not as active or aggressive on this front, because that renewed vigor is actually all intertwined with a renewed Christendom.
You make a fair point, that the idea that there's a consistency in their whole life. They're wanting everything to be on track, following God's way. And I agree with that. And is the solution, or this thing I want is a pulling back, pacifism, quietism? Absolutely not.
Oh, right. Yeah, I get that.
Not. Yeah. So, yeah. All right.
Yeah. One more question here, and this is kind of just to both of you. Are there different historical examples? I know Kierkegaard was mentioned, obviously Constantine, obviously, during Luther's time, but are there examples that you can give of, Joel, on your side, where you're saying, hey, here's examples where we know that in this Christian society, the spiritualism is still kind of dead, or vice versa, where you're saying, in these times of Christendom, there still is a more heightened vigor that, is not being, decimated or brought low by the comfortability of being surrounded by, Christian princes and good laws and whatnot. So I'll just open that up to both of you.
Well, I guess I'd probably invoke Luther again in his assessment of how many people are real Christians, 1 in 1,000 maybe. And then you've got Kierkegaard's assessment of Europe, and especially Central Europe, where he was living in his day in Denmark. I think even the U.S. in the early 20th century, you talked about living in America 100 years ago. I'm not sure I would think it was an improvement necessarily, because there's a lot of nasty stuff in the world today, and I hate it. And yet there's a clarity that I know what it means to follow Christ. My kids know what it means to follow Christ, and people I work with in the congregation, the students, this is what it means to be who we are. And so I think that the pitfalls are very real, and the downside is there. And maybe it's a generational thing. I can grant you that. But I think those are my concrete examples. Even growing up as a kid in small town, rural Nebraska in the 60s, everybody was on the same page, and yet, they weren't, and so it's not quite as the panacea as we maybe think it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to romanticize the past. And I would also point out, like when you say about giving examples, we could both give any example and then show how there were good times and bad times.
Right.
Lutheran Saxony got better as generations went on, and as those children and grandchildren got more catechized It improved in many metrics. Under Constantine, people did actually get Christianized, but there was also decadence and hypocrisy and things like that. So I don't think that I could ever come up with a perfect historical example, but rather I would note this, that whenever the church had opportunity to influence the society, culture, laws of the surrounding society or of the nation or jurisdiction, whatever, they took that risk. And that's why I would say it's a necessary risk. And I think we see the example. Now, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you might say, yeah, well, that's because it's very tempting. But I would say, I don't think it's because of temptation. I think they're following the biblical model laid out among, Israel and also the Gentile nations, that in the Old Testament, that whenever the church had an opportunity to create Christendom, they took it. And I don't think that was just because of temptation. I mean, Constantine's the huge example, but you have places like Edessa in Syria. They go Christian before the Roman Empire does. You have Armenia, they do it. And wherever the missionaries go out, there is not just an expectation, but I would say a natural outgrowth of proper Christian vocation that the society is Christianized.
Okay, I think some of that is more reflective of the wider gestalt of the whole culture. Because you're talking Odessa and then Syria, even Constantine, you're still living in a world pre-Augsburg, Peace of Augsburg, where we are this country, we are this faith, this is how we do it. We now reached majority level, now we're our Christian nation. This is Constantine.
It's territorialism. Yeah.
That's right. We're there. This is what we have. We're not living in that kind of world anymore. The globalized world of everything is just a completely different dynamic, and whether that would work or not. So go ahead on that.
No, I was going to say,
I want to make sideways.
I totally agree with you that we're not living in the same world, but I'm saying that the idea of territorialism and the idea of that being a goal or an eventuality is an eventuality, whether it be Christian or Muslim or Jewish or pagan.
I won't disagree with that. We'll see how things play out, whether, the huge, vast nation states continue on, or if we end up retreating to more, kind of.
And this gets to a fundamental point of mine, is that pluralism is inherently unstable and is not going to last.
Yes and no, but see, there's always a pluralism. Even when Saxony, there's not a kind of cohesive, bang, bang, bang uniform.
Yes, true, absolutely. You can even just see this with the different Lutheran church orders in Germany. Right. But that's within certain bounds. Yes. I would say that a pluralistic society like most Western countries, where there are vast differences between religion, if you want to throw in political, philosophical systems, morality, ethnic groups, all of that kind of stuff. I think that that's inherently destabilizing, and they are eventually going to become more homogenous by necessity. So it's going to happen. Well, we might as well have it be our way.
Well, who's the our is the part of the problem, but should it be God's way?
I would agree with that. There you go. Yeah,
should it be God's way?
When I say our way, I don't mean the church in an idolatrous way. I mean the church faithfully confessing.
Yeah. Now, the other thing I want to pick up on is the idea that the church has always jumped on those opportunities and taken it. And maybe that was a temptation, but see, I'm totally in favor of the church making an impact on the culture, and it will. But to me, it's always a side thing. It's sort of like it happens even though we weren't aiming at it. And so I'll go back even further to even like Paul in the first century, when the first gospel is going out, and he's like in Ephesus, and he's there. He makes it real clear. We're not here to undo anything. We're not here to take over the country. We're not over here to take over anything. We're just merely preaching the gospel. That's all we're doing here. Yeah. And maybe it's naive on Paul's part. Maybe I think he's quite sincere about it. But in fact, does the church impact the culture profoundly? Yeah, undoes it. Completely changes everything. Kavin Rowe has this outstanding book about Acts called The World Upside Down, where he kind of talks about the huge social, political impacts, even though they weren't aiming at it. And see, this is to me the ideal. The church simply lives the way it should. I raise my kids. I spend my money. I vacation. I care for people around me the way I should, the way God calls me to. That makes an impact. And if more people start doing it, it makes more of an impact. But it's the idea of taking my authority and making it happen and getting legislation. It's counterproductive. The better is the organic. It just happens. And we've got the critical mass of 51% now say, this is how I'm going to live. Great. Let's all pass a law on that. Yeah, it makes absolute sense. Of course we will. But it's not something that, and now you 49, you are the losers. Sorry. No, you're still the object of our zeal to try to bring you into Christ and do it the right way, to bring you into the church, not by compulsion. And you agreed with that too. You can't force somebody to believe. We all know that.
You can't force them to faith.
But we can absolutely create a better moral world. I agree with that.
Yeah. So I totally agree with what you said about it happening in an organic and almost up,
secondary
bottom side,
yeah.
Bottom up way.
Yeah.
But I would just say I don't view it as an either or. Now, in terms of wisdom or prudence, you got to be careful of that mix and how you do it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, yes, I totally admit a lot of those changes in the empire, pre-Constantine, were because of Christians living their lives, not even able to enforce laws.
That's right.
But I would, I guess, go further and say, but by the time of Theodosius, I have no problem him outlawing gladiatorial games.
Yeah.
Outlawing.
Sure.
So I guess to simplify it, are you okay with there is this organic bottom-up transformation, but also when and where there's the opportunity, it's fine for some top-down stuff.
Sure.
Okay. Because that's what Luther does. He wants patience. He wants to preach. He wants to give them a chance, like with both kinds in the sacrament. But at a certain point, he says, we've talked enough about this. We need this enforced.
No, I agree.
Okay.
I've got one more question here, and then we can move on to our last section. And that is, one of the things that maybe we haven't touched on completely, but is just, and this is something that's very tangible, right? Like it's very accessible, and there's examples today of this happening, right? And that is protecting a local community, right? So there's examples of this. There's a couple places down south that have put like very rigid laws on what takes place in their local community. And sometimes they're aligned towards Christian values. Sometimes they've got, other values that they're trying to kind of assert in that area. Another example is what Doug Wilson's done over in Moscow, which is basically where a group of Christians went to an area and they said, we're going to go here and we're going to make a Christian nation here in this town, right? So they go and they're like, we'll take over the school board. We're going to make sure these things are the kinds of local laws that are put into place, and kind of create a protective place where Christians will live as if, it was Saxony, Germany or something like that, right? So what would your thoughts be on aiming towards that? Because that's something that local communities, depending on where they're at, Minneapolis can't do this, but hypothetically, Waconia could, and definitely something like Leicester Prairie. In other words, as you get to a town of 1,500, like they really could actively accomplish something like that in 2 years. What's your thoughts there?
I mean, I'm really short on this. Like, I've never been a huge Doug Wilson fan, frankly. I think he's a little overrated, just to be frank. So I might not be the best person to ask about him. I mean, he's an interesting guy, but I think that what I'm more concerned about is what would a reformed Christian nationalism look like, from a Lutheran perspective. So I'm going to have disagreements with him, but to zoom out to the broad picture of Christians in general saying, hey, we want to create a little Christendom, I'll just put it this way. That does not freak me out. I think that that's something that's exciting. It's not always going to be done the right way. I would have the Lutheran Reformed issues on that. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's a post-millennial, which I think is weird and goofy. So
that's always goofy.
Yeah. But I mean, if we kind of abstract it away from that particular example to get to the heart of the matter, in my reaction anyway, talking about people or hearing about people making little Christendoms, that doesn't freak me out. It makes me excited. And that's my general reaction. Yeah.
To me, it smells a little bit too much like let's retreat, create our little, Rod Dreher kind of,
he would totally disagree with that.
Okay.
Yeah. To be fair.
You disagree with
Rod Dreher.
Disagree with what Wilson's doing?
No, Wilson would disagree with Dreher in the sense of he's very active.
He wants to stay engaged.
Oh yes, absolutely. Okay, right. I mean, I have my differences with his writings.
Yeah. And to be fair, and once again, take Wilson's theology and whatnot out, but I do think that what they've done is they've created a community and then they've worked on expanding that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they've done that with creating a public, they've got Canon Press, they've got a university, right? So it's not just a retreat. It's you go back to where you can create and then you expand.
Yeah. And so am I freaked out by that? Not necessarily freaked out by it. And if you got the majority of people who are saying that's fine, Yeah, but see, even your hesitation there's weird things that kind of come along with it often.
Oh, sure.
And that's the liability side of it. Now we're back to what kind of witness are we giving to those people who are feeling like someone's just taken over our world here, you know? And is that a good thing or not? And I'm not convinced it is always.
Which drives me to want Christians to, and that drives me to want Lutherans to speak about this more of how do you do Christendom with all of its pitfalls and potential hypocrisy? How do you do it well? Okay. Because I think it's going to happen. I've already said, I think more homogenous, more unified communities are always an eventuality. The only question is which one is going to be the dominant force. So why not use our wisdom and beautiful doctrine from the Word of God that we've received to help shape that?
Because most people don't care about it and don't want it. And so...
Well, that doesn't stop us from evangelizing.
No, it doesn't. And see, but this evangelism is very different than a Benedict option or than a taking over and building Christendom. And so I wouldn't
you can call it the Boniface option is actually a name for that.
What's that?
The Boniface option.
Yeah, that's Andrew Isker. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And... But, okay, so you said something interesting about evangelism. Yes, obviously, the church has to keep the first priority. I totally agree.
All right.
Obviously. But at the same time, I think Luther's example of preaching to rulers, and not just Frederick, or any of the electors of Saxony, but also to Charles V. I mean, Luther had an office. I'm not talking about people just being yahoos, but Luther had an office, and he viewed it as part of his duty to preach to magistrates as magistrates about their Christian duty.
No, agreed.
Yeah.
No, agreed. So no, I'm fine with that. There's a place for that. But again, it's secondary, tertiary, whatever.
I agree.
I'm not always... People sometimes kind of lose track of that. Yeah. The prioritizing.
Well, I reread part of your book when you said, what does this look like on the ground? I'm summarizing, but you said, if, pastors are just making political sermons as a huge chunk of their sermonizing, this is not a good thing.
Correct.
And I agree with that. Yet I do think that probably our tendency in the Missouri Synod is the opposite one.
I agree with that too.
Okay.
That's why I wrote what I wrote.
Yeah, sure.
Is a room for politics in the sermon, of course.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, so we can move to the fifth, although I know you guys were having a discussion on the break.
I think it'll
about
fit in
the topic.
The fifth.
Okay. I don't know what that topic is.
Let's just
asking.
Just go ahead.
Do you guys want to jump into that first, or do you want me to
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
You lead.
So this last area is we're zooming out a little bit to broader implications with church politics and particularly conservatism, because these two things can often get mixed up. So there's kind of 3 sub-questions here. I'm just going to go ahead and give them all out, and that way you can kind of decide which one you would like to go into first. So the first is, does the church structures like the LCMS Synod in the way that we're structured today, maybe something like LCMS Inc., does that blur the two kingdoms? And maybe to put it even another way, does it blur the purpose of the church, where sometimes we kind of see the church as centered around a institution rather than maybe where people are gathered around word and sacrament or something like that. The second one is, are conservative political values truly Christian or merely cultural? In other words, do we mix these up and we say, okay, well, as long as we're pushing for conservatism or even against abortion or things like that, that's by its necessity Christian? And the third is a little bit different, but do nations themselves have God-given spiritual tasks? And we can unpack that one. I'm guessing we won't jump to that one first. So I'll open that up. Joel, I don't know if you want to take one of these as a lead off.
Well, I'll start with the church part. And, does the church get the realms messed up and kind of goof the stuff up? I think so. And I think even on our LCMS heritage, we have had a tendency to not play out the two kingdoms or two realms in a faithful, helpful way, where it too often becomes sort of almost an excuse for, this is just the church in its left hand. And Kurt Marquardt, actually, in his little book on church and ministry, does a great job of saying the church needs to be called to act like the church. And it's when we let the church act like the world that we get the problems coming in. And so in other words, we should always be expecting the church to be the church. We are those who are following Christ together. We live according to his way. Proclamation of the gospel is the driving thing. That's what we are as the church. And so LCMS Inc. can't say, well, we're just a left-hand institution helping these congregations to be the church. No, it needs to act like the church too. It needs to have the same kinds of criteria, the same kinds of standards, the same kinds of ways of operating. And so what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And it doesn't, in my opinion, work for the synod to say, well, we're just functioning now as a left-hand entity. No, you're always the church. And that's part of my whole kind of thing on the witness. So when LCMS, as corporate LCMS, does something, the world doesn't say, oh, that's just a left-hand body. That is the church. And so we should see it that way too and be consistent on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I would move to the second question if that's okay. Which, just to repeat, are conservative values actually Christian?
Political values, truly Christian or merely cultural?
Yeah, but particularly conservative political values, right?
Yeah, and I think you could take it both. I would say in the LCMS, it's pretty rare for someone. The ELCA might take liberal political values and
not too often
mix those, but not too often in the LCMS.
Generally speaking, I mean, we have our problems with social justice warriors. Not true justice, but, kind of the world's justice. But anyway, I would say, like, generally speaking, that just depends on which value or which position. It doesn't matter what position or what party it's aligned with. It's got to be judged by the Word of God, and I know we would agree on that. And then we'd have to diagnose each one of those things. Of course, it's a temptation to just be like, okay, here's a party that more lines up with biblical morality, so we're going to agree with everything that party says. That's always a temptation. It's very easy or neat and tidy. And so that can be a ditch to fall into. But with saying that, I would say that we are at a moment where politics and the faith are intertwined to a higher degree than, let's say, 70 years ago or 100 years ago. To me, it's very similar to the French Revolution, where you do have just total radical revolutionary forces trying to upend French, Catholic Christendom in the country. And it's not just a political disagreement. The further and further the revolution goes on, the more and more people on different political sides, that intertwines with their understanding of the faith. And I don't think we should be naive to the fact that intertwining happens. You know what I mean? And so it's no surprise that in a very, very bifurcated America that's politically with huge gaping chasms of difference politically, you also have a obvious intertwining of the faith with certain political opinions that's just going to happen. It's no surprise that in counter-revolutionary France, a lot of people who didn't take the faith very seriously all of a sudden were like, you know what? I was not a sincere Christian, but now I really do see the value of Christendom and maybe the actual faith as well, because they're so appalled by the atrocities against all human reason and natural law that the revolutionaries are doing. And so you do have this intertwining of politics and religion. So I think we have to recognize that, even though you have to be careful not to conflate the two. But there's always this intertwining, and I think we're at a point where there's more intertwining than normal.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the comparison to the French Revolution. That gives me pause.
Okay.
So as far as the intertwining, I don't know it. I would compare our present situation in the U.S. in the 21st century to France Revolution, kind of, that we have people trying to go almost in an anarchist, tear it all down. There are some, and I suppose that they're real and they're out there.
I would say we're not there yet, but
okay.
But the bifurcation is, I think, comparable.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not sure if it's a new thing, though, because there's always been that kind of radical anarchist kind of a thing. It's always been a subset of how it works in the Western culture. It's not a specifically new thing. So that part, I'm not so sure if I have a strong opinion about that or can say much about that. What I would speak about is the conservatism, and I do think there is a strong tendency among Bible-believing, church-attending LCMS people to equate their Christian faith with conservatism. And while there are a lot of things that Christians would be conservative about, social, kind of social, sexual mores, obviously, those kinds of things, the way we raise our kids, right and wrong, what justice looks like. I think we need to be very careful. And this is one of my concerns about Christian nationalism, that we're not more interested in propping up conservatism than we are Christianity. I read a book a couple summers ago by Yoram Hazany on conservatism. Big fat book, and he's Jewish, practicing Jewish, but he was raised as a secularist, kind of, brilliant kind of guy in the university. Then he became ardent in his Judaism for the sake of conservatism. And what struck me about his book is, it's like, he's a champion of conservatism, and he's instrumentalizing religion as a tool towards conservatism. That's alarming to me. And I think it's not that uncommon for even Christians to fall into this, that conservative values, this conservative value, this candidate, this particular party. I read somewhere that only Mormons have more Republicans per capita than the LCMS. We are the most Republican of all the denominations in the U.S. Only Mormons have more Republicans per capita than we do, which is doesn't surprise me at all. I kind of knew this, but I think the problem is you start having that conservatism becomes the goal instead of following Christ and teaching others to know Christ and living in the reality of the gospel and his plans for the eschatological fulfillment. Instead, we're actually using religion as a tool to make sure we're staying conservative. And there's a lot of that going on, I think, and I get quite concerned about that.
Well, I think that is an ever-present danger to put second things first. And that's always the reason why I have a little hesitancy about the term Christian nationalism, because of the 19th century implications of that.
Yeah.
In terms of what did nationalism mean back then? It meant all estates need to be subsumed under the nation and the nation's gold, including the church.
Right.
However, I think that the term nationalism today, in our context, even though many people who know intellectual history and whatnot are aware of how that was used in previous centuries, today nationalism, I would say, in kind of like the common usage, is not about that, but about against globalism. And so it's more about the localism that you were championing earlier. And so I don't know a Christian nationalist, especially reading the people who have written these best-selling books, who would argue with anything you just said.
Okay.
Like the church cannot be just put into service.
Yeah.
These need to be two distinct realms, cooperation, but not one over the other.
Yeah.
They actually say everything you're talking about.
Okay.
And when they say nationalism, it is as opposed to globalism.
Okay.
All right. If you want to introduce the topic you guys were talking about, this would be a good time to bring it in, because then we're going to move to, we've got a couple submitted questions, so we'll do about 2 of those or so to close.
You can edit this out if you want, but you skipped your third one.
Yeah, we can maybe circle back to that.
But I have no idea what it means. I'm fine with skipping it.
Yeah,
Do nations themselves have God-given spiritual tasks? I have no idea what that person means.
Yeah, that falls into one of the submitted questions. So I don't know if that's one of those that we'll get to.
I have no idea what the person means.
Yeah. No, go. Yeah. So if you want to introduce what you guys were talking about, we can do that, and then we'll go to some of these submitted
I don't even know
questions.
what that means. So
yeah.
It's like, okay. Yeah. So I guess by way of introduction to bring this up, you had spoken about a very shocking examples or parallel examples about how Christians or the church can give witness.
Yeah.
And I think you did this in Michigan.
Okay.
I have some buddies in Michigan who listened to your presentation, but I also saw some clips floating around on the internet on this. And since I did actually do some homework, I figured I should. I think it might be interesting to bring this up in terms of what you mean by what's a better witness.
No, the witness is the key part of this. That's fine.
Yeah, I'm fascinated in the example, but if you want to give the example.
Well, I was at the district convention for Michigan District, and I was talking about the unique task of the church, providing a witness to the world in spite of the world's decadence and pressure we're getting from the world. We have this opportunity to provide this witness. And it had just happened within 24 hours of when I gave my presentation. It was just right there, because I think I was there on a Monday and it had happened on a Sunday. So there was a congregation in the Detroit area where a guy had come, crazy guy, armed to the teeth, and was going to go in and shoot up a church. And he got spotted in the parking lot, got run over by some guy with his car,
Because he had guns out or something.
Yeah, he had guns out, belts, gun belts and everything, and the whole thing. And so we got run over. But then the security detail from that congregation, it was an evangelical church, came out and liquidated him. They shot him, they killed him. Yeah. And they were low key about it. Nobody wanted to admit who had done it, but it was the church's security detail that did that. And so that went down. And then within almost at that exact same time, because it was Sunday evening in Syria, there was a congregation that Muslim extremists came in and shot up people and blew up the congregation, and like 20 some people died. And so I just raised the question, what witness was given in each such situation? And what's that look like? And I just left it as an open question. What do you think? What are we witnessing? My concern is that when the church is protecting herself and trying to take care of herself and demanding her rights and demanding her fair share and trying to assert her place, I think it becomes counterproductive to the witness she gives, because then we start to look like the rest of the world. We start to look like everybody else looks. We're not being the distinct reality of a new way of being that we follow Christ and what that actually looks like. That's my concern. And so the witness, I think, given by the martyrs who were made in that congregation in Syria, it's tragic and it's sad and it's horrible, and we don't want that for any of our people. And yet they're willing to say, we gather for worship, and if people do this to us, we don't retaliate. We don't have a plan in place to, kill them first, in a sense. And that's kind of the point, I guess. And so that to me gets to the idea of the witness. What are we witnessing? Are we witnessing Christian muscle? Are we witnessing Christian force? Are we witnessing Christian ability to take on things and win? That's just, I think, is totally the wrong mentality. The witness we have following Christ is, he's my Lord. He's my protector. I'm going to follow him. I'm going to do things his way, and he'll take care of the rest. That to me is the core of witness.
So I guess there's two things in response. One, when I heard you give this example, something struck me as interesting, that only 20 people died, because from my understanding of Syrian Orthodox Christians, they have bigger congregations than 20 people.
There were like 60 injured. So
right. I know. Yeah. And so I was interested in that because, and I dug into it a little bit more, because the Orthodox typically are fine defending themselves. Now, Christians, from my understanding, aren't allowed to have guns, or very, very strict gun laws over in Syria.
Yeah.
But I dug into it and I read the homily by the patriarch who came and did the funeral service.
Oh, okay.
And it was interesting because I know you can still make your broader theological point.
Yeah.
But just for your information, he preached a sermon and they did not just allow that guy to come in. Young men actually stopped this crazy, tackled him, knew that he was trying to get into the sanctuary, didn't let him get all the way in.
That's great.
There was like 250 people in there.
Yeah, okay.
So they did actively, violently resist. The only reason why it didn't go down like in Michigan was because they didn't have firearms.
Yeah.
But they did actively resist, and the patriarch was like, these guys are heroes for doing this.
Okay.
So,
well, I'll clarify this then. So the stopping somebody from doing evil, that's fine. I'm not saying, here I am, shoot me. So in other words, can I say, can I duck? Can I tackle him? Can I stop him from causing harm? That's fine. To me, it's taking the lethal resistance becomes the kind of the upping the game a little bit. And that's my concern.
Okay. So now maybe there's a distinction between when the Christians are gathered as a worshiping community, that you would make a distinction between that and somebody attacking a home.
There's a difference. Absolutely. Because the church as worshiping community is absolutely there to witness the reality of Christ. Stellar example.
So I'll just be honest and frank. I think those guys who shot or ran over and used lethal force, I think they're heroes. I think that that's totally in accordance with their vocation as a man, as a protector to their wives and children, the old people there. So I want to push you on, are you saying that it's a better witness? Obviously, you're saying you can resist. Is the issue just the lethal force?
It is. That's the big part of it. Absolutely, yeah. Because the lethal force ended a life. That's not my job. And that's not my task at that point. Now, you raise the vocation and the responsibility of vocation. That's obviously the compelling argument to make. And I get that. And I totally understand that. But I also think we need to make the argument of, and what does Christ call us to do? And do we take seriously the Sermon on the Mount or not? And if we're not going to live it in the church sanctuary, where are we going to live it?
Yeah, but I mean, you're talking about turn the other cheek, right? Yeah, but I mean, that's not talking about notorious irremediable, I can't pronounce the word, irremediable harm. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't think that's
I don't
what
think
it's
it makes a difference.
About.
I think you're nuancing the exegesis.
I mean, not according to Luther. Now, I know I'm appealing to Luther, but I mean, Luther is fine with self-defense, even lethal.
He grants it as a natural understanding of how things work, but he also says Christians don't have to do that.
Okay, I'm not saying in all situations Christians have to do that, especially if there's overwhelming force, like Polycarp. He does run, he does move from house to house, but when the game's up, he willingly submits. He doesn't fight tooth and nail. I grant that there's a time and a place to say, you've got me, there's no point in resisting, but I think that's different when you do have the means and the ability to fulfill your God-given vocation towards other Christians and even yourself as God gave you your life.
Yes, and I grant you the idea of my responsibility to care for those around me and what that looks like. But I also need to care for them in a spiritual way by showing them what I'm serious about following Christ. And I think there's something to be said for that. I'm saying the question should be raised and should be thought about. We shouldn't be so quick to dismiss it as, wait, I have a right to defend myself. I have a responsibility to do this. And so therefore lethal force is always justified. Not so sure.
I didn't say that it was a right. I know you don't like the rights language, but I would say it's a duty.
Okay. And I get that. The vocational responsibility is there, but see, also as a vocation as pastor or father, I have to ask, what is the more important thing here? Are there worse things than death? And there are.
I agree with you there. Yeah. I'm not going to say that life is always the highest good. I would never say that. But I mean, I know I'm throwing out other examples, but like, a woman who's about to be raped, can she shoot the attacker?
She can absolutely resist and fight back. And
I mean lethal force.
Yeah. And so where does she aim? I don't know. You know, I don't want to get into the nuances of all this stuff, but should she be hesitant about you shooting? I think you should be some hesitation about using lethal force.
Yeah. But I mean, again, I know you don't want to drill down into the specifics, but I mean, as a pastor, as a father, I've told my sons and daughters, if it is clear, just grant me that it's a clear, imminent threat of severe bodily or harm or life and death, at that point, do not hesitate. I mean, if you need to think through things beforehand, but you do have a duty to defend yourself, others, and when there's irremediable.
Yeah,
notorious injury.
I'm not sure if I would say I have a duty to defend myself. I think it's God's job to defend me.
But He pours out His vengeance through the state. Through the church.
That's through those who have been given that authority, who have been given the sword.
Yeah.
So, and to what extent have I been given a sword? I'm not too convinced of that.
Well, I mean, Luther would say that. He says that fathers are obligated. To care
for
their children.
Sure.
Well, but also to defend if somebody comes in to do bodily harm.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess I am not hesitant to say use lethal force. There's some circumstances where that's not the right time to do it. You have no chance of winning, and so show yourself unafraid. But at the same time, I just think Orthodox Christians, like the example you brought up, or those Baptist evangelicals or whoever they were, like I view that as them doing their Christian duty to protect the people God's given them. Yeah,
and you can make that argument, and I'm not going to disagree with that. You can make a solid argument for they're doing their vocational responsibility, caring for those who are in their charge. I get that. But I think I can also make a case for what is the church witnessing to the world about who our Lord is and how we live and the things that matter to us, and about our unwillingness to use lethal force, even though the world would encourage us to, or common sense would encourage us to. I think we should be careful about where does lethal force fit, and is it consistent with the confession I'm trying to make about who my Lord is and who's caring for me?
Well, can I flip that around for a second? Because I think that while someone who is, kind of trigger happy, that is very easily not a good confession.
Correct.
But at the same time, what I worry about, which I don't think you're implying, but what I worry about is if we tell people, a better witness would be to allow it to happen or not use lethal force. I worry about the church telling people, especially men, to be a Christian is to be less than a man.
No. You don't equate being a man with using lethal force.
I'm not equating.
So
but it's part of it.
Can I put myself in front of the bullet? Absolutely. Can I try to tackle him? Can I even use a baseball bat and knock him down? I don't have a problem with that. My issue becomes the lethal force. That becomes the issue.
Well, I'm not equating being a man with using lethal force, but I think part and parcel of being a man, especially a father or husband or a brother,
is caring for and defending.
Yeah, and when necessary to do that.
Necessary to do what is that? And see
to defend or to kill.
Yeah, well, see, to kill. I'm not crazy about that. I won't grant.
I don't think it's the best.
I know.
Option,
I get
you
that.
Know what I mean?
But I would say I don't know if there's ever a justified place for that. I would be hesitant. Now, I'm not going for every possible circumstance, but I'm saying especially in the divine service when we're gathered to worship as the body of Christ, if there's ever a time when we should look like Christ looks, of following in the way of nonviolence, I think that's the place where it should happen. If nowhere else, at least there.
See, I would agree because I don't know if you've heard these debates among pastors.
Nope.
But should the pastor carry? I do not think that you should have a firearm when
we're on the same page.
I agree with you there. But I have no problem with ushers or other people not helping with the service, but who are carrying.
Yeah, I don't think you make the distinction. They're all part of that body of Christ there on that morning. So that's my concern.
But I would say they're actually guarding those who are there.
But they're not. You see, if you want to guard, then bring in your rent-a-cop and let him take care of things. That's kind of where I'm serious. I think there's a distinction there. Or let the civil government take care of it. If you feel a threat, talk to your local sheriff. Maybe he'll park a patrol car outside. I have no problem with that. But I do have a problem with the church itself protecting itself.
And that's where I do think that like the overlapping duties of the three estates would lead me to say, I'm fine with that. I would even encourage it, especially, I know that you're saying we should be hesitant to take a life.
Yep.
Obviously, I agree.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, if you are going to be in that situation, you have to mentally prepare, am I willing to do this or not? In the heat of the moment, you need to already have a decision.
No, I know. I agree with that. And that's why I'm saying the three estates are overlapping, but they need to be very distinct in what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
And the estate of church is here to proclaim the gospel. And I think that proclamation gets compromised when it starts doing what it shouldn't be doing.
I agree that it's sticky, but I mean, like if there's a fire, I'm going to call 911.
Absolutely, of course.
You know what I mean? I know you would agree with me, but my point is that like I changed from I'm doing pastoral duties to there's an emergency and I need to help people.
Right.
And that would be the same thing. People come in to kill people. I want Christian men to be ready to go if they need to.
I want Christian men ready to intervene, stop him, tackle him, whatever. To pull out their weapon? No, I don't think it should have a weapon.
So that's your line?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
But not in the home. In the home is different?
The home is different, can be different. I can get that. But I can also make the case for a Christian man who says, no, we're not going to have guns in this house. We're not going to do it that way. God will take care of us.
Well, regardless of the sticky question about guns, I mean, like, let's stick with lethal force.
Yeah.
Like, so
if you're trying to stop him from doing harm and he ends up dying in the process, that's tragic. But I'm not aiming at that. So in other words, like I smack him with a baseball bat and end up killing him.
And he dies because of a brain aneurysm.
Yeah, horrible. And do I feel guilt over that? I think I would. And I think I should.
Well, there's going to be spiritual and mental
That's exactly.
damage.
But see, in other words, to me, having a baseball bat under your bed is very different than having a 45 under your bed. To me, that's a difference.
Yeah, and this is definitely a difference between us because I think we should say, you men are protectors and providers in part, not to equate it with. It's not like I'm saying if you haven't killed someone, you're not a man. But I would say, and this is what I teach to my boys, you have to be prepared for it.
Okay. Yeah. And I'd be prepared to what? And that's where
if necessary, use lethal force.
Yeah, I wouldn't use lethal force.
Okay.
That's the difference.
Okay.
Yeah. All right.
Because of the harm of witness?
That's a big part of it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. The witness I'm giving even to my own family. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you, guys. That was good. So we're probably running up on time here. We're definitely running up on time just as far as even flights go. So let's go ahead and we'll finish in this way. So I'll give each of you a chance for closing statements, just to kind of maybe summarize, take key takeaways that you derived from this conversation. But within that, if you can also just kind of give a vision of where you would like us to go, right? So kind of back to what are some tangibles that you would like to see the church doing in the next, now the next 5 years, kind of in accordance with the way that you understand the church's role when it comes to witness, when it comes to Christian nationalism or Christendom, or the kind of the ways that we engage this. So, Dave, if you want to start, and then Joel will give you last words.
I would just go back to my 4 points. I'm very appreciative that I think that in terms of most of the ideal we agree on, that there should be not confusion between the realms or the estates, but cooperation. Yeah. So I'm really happy about that. I think that, again, I would just reaffirm or emphasize, I think it's a necessary risk. I think that the only question is what is going to shape a society and what blasphemy laws are going to be instituted. So let's live out our vocations in doing that in a good way. Last but not least, you asked about what would I like to see happen. I would like to see a lot more conversations like this to drill down on the particularities, whether it be very specifically using lethal force in a self-defense situation, but a whole myriad of other topics and discussions, because for far too long we've had the boring debate between separation of church and state as envisioned by Thomas Jefferson, not even the early American Republic, versus some form of Christendom, very broadly defined. And I would like to see that discussion advanced. Yeah. Because that's where the interesting stuff is. On the ground, I really hope that pastors and laymen and professors and our seminaries and synodical leaders put in focus and time and energy into saying, what does it look like to live out our Christian vocations in the state or in civil society? Because here's where I think we're going to agree. A lot of it has been very kind of jingoistic or hackneyed or utterly aligned with allegedly American Christian values. Right. And it isn't actually flowing from our forefathers. I think books should be written. I mean, the Reformed world has a very vibrant discussion on this because books were actually written on this very particular question. And I do think that more stuff needs to be, because, I mean, let's face it, we're not like the charismatics where everyone's talking about it in a folk way or in a conference way. We like texts, and I would submit that the Augsburg Confession and the entire Christian Book of Concord really do have Christendom or Christian nationalist assumptions surrounding it. And we need to at least assert in the broader Christian sphere and within our own people, like, how do you do this well? Because other people are going to come up with really bad ideas. And I think we got to assert how we're going to do this well. And we do have a great treasure trove, not just of church history, but our own confessional documents. And so I hope the conversation is purposefully advanced along these lines.
Yeah, I would agree. The Augsburg Confession certainly came out of that kind of a context of a Christendom. That's what they were living in. And so a lot of the stuff fits into that. But I don't know that I would say the Book of Concord is actually advancing a Christendom or even a Christian nationalist kind of agenda.
Well, I said it has assumptions.
Okay, the assumptions are undergirding. That's no doubt the case because of the context from which it's written. So what do I want to have happen? My biggest thing would be I would love to see families, Christians, congregations zealously seeking to say, let's live the Christian life in our own homes and our own congregations. Let's do it the way God would have us do it. Let's live according to God's truth. Let's live according to the reality of the gospel present in my life and take the commandments of God seriously and take his will for my life seriously and care for those around me and show the love for those around me and be willing to go the hard road of following Christ even when it doesn't fit what I want or feel comfortable or fit the agenda of anybody else. And in the process, that becomes a really vibrant and compelling witness to the world. That's what I would love to see have happen. So it's pretty simple and not too complicated, I guess. That's about it.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. This it's not easy to step into a debate format. And we talked about this before. This is your first debate for both of you. So kudos for having the courage to step in. And thank you for all of that. And thank you to, again, Luther Classical College, again, who has underwritten and sponsored this. We're very excited to be working with them on this debate, of course, but then the 5 that are upcoming. If you're still watching and you have ideas on debate topics that you would like to see discussed, please leave those in the comments below. Of course, you can always email and reach out as we continue to craft those. So thank you. God bless and cheers.